She was 20 and homeless. No room, no family, no paper that proved she belonged anywhere. Just a canvas satchel and $4 she had saved by not eating dinner on 3 cold evenings. And with that $4, she bought an abandoned apothecary shop forgotten near Eureka Springs in Carroll County, Arkansas, a hill town whose healing spring ledgers fell off county maps in 1911. One front window had buckled inward from rot. Rain came through a seam above the back chimney. The county had condemned it since 1998 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath a marble mortar in the rear workroom, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 90 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Maren Bell had been vanishing her whole life without knowing it. She was the kind of child who learned early how to pass through a room without touching the sides of it, how to close a drawer so the latch did not speak, how to breathe shallowly when grown people stood in doorways deciding what kind of weather they would become. In Bentonville, where the streets widened each year and the fields withdrew behind fences and signs, Hazel grew up in a rental duplex with thin carpet and kitchen cabinets that smelled faintly of damp flour. The house sat behind a tire store and beside a drainage ditch, and every hard rain brought crawdads up into the gravel like little armored thoughts. She noticed what others left unnamed: a leaf torn by beetles, a bruise on a pear where a thumb had pressed too firmly, the exact sound a person made before saying something unkind. As a girl, she kept jars on the sill, not with butterflies pinned or trapped, but with sprigs of things she had found along the ditch and identified from borrowed library books. Plantain, yarrow, mullein, boneset. She wrote their names on masking tape and stuck the labels with careful block letters, the kind a teacher once praised and then forgot. Her mother, Lorna, worked the early shift at a laundry attached to a motel near the highway. She came home smelling of bleach, wet cotton, and the faint metallic heat of dryers that had run too long. Lorna had once been soft in the way tired women can be soft, not with words, but with small preserved gestures. She cut toast into triangles for Hazel until Hazel was 13. She rinsed mason jars and saved them for the child's roots and leaves. She did not laugh when Hazel said jewelweed was better than any drugstore cream for nettle sting. She only nodded, weary but exact, and placed the jar on the window ledge where morning could find it. Hazel's father had been gone since before memory had put down roots. His name was kept in the house as one might keep a broken chair in a shed, not useful, not discussed, but still present in a shape nobody moved. Lorna said he had been a surveyor, then said he had been a drifter, then said nothing at all. Hazel learned not to ask. The absent man existed only in a field compass with a cracked face, wrapped in a sock at the bottom of Lorna's cedar chest, and in Hazel's own tendency to study horizons as if they might return what they had taken. The person who gave Hazel a language for her carefulness was not a parent, but her grandmother's younger sister, Willa Bell, whom everyone in the family called Aunt Willa, though she had never cared for titles. Willa lived 23 miles east in a narrow house shaded by persimmon and black walnut trees, down a road that lifted and fell like a sleeping animal's ribs. She had been a nurse's aide for 30 years, but on weekends she became what Hazel later understood to be a practical botanist, an herbal woman, a keeper of names that had nearly been crowded out by capsules, plastic bottles, and quick advice. Every Saturday Lorna could spare the gas. She drove Hazel to Willa's house and left her there from morning until supper. Willa wore cotton dresses the colour of washed clay, heavy shoes, and a man's wristwatch that had belonged to nobody she would name. Her hands were square, speckled, and strong, with nails kept short for cleaning roots. She did not speak much before 9 o'clock. She let the kettle click, let the floorboards settle. Let Hazel sit at the table until the child stopped trying to be good and started being present. Then they went out. They walked fence lines, creek banks, ditches, abandoned lots, and the back edges of cemeteries where the grass grew high against leaning stones. Willa carried a canvas field bag and a folding knife sharpened to a patient edge. Hazel carried a notebook sewn together from brown grocery paper and white string. Willa taught by naming once, then waiting. She would touch a stem and say square stem, mint family. Or she would break a leaf and hold it under Hazel's nose without explanation. Lemon balm, self-heal, wild bergamot, black cohosh in the shaded places, bloodroot never to be handled carelessly, sassafras, sweet under the bark, pokeweed, beautiful and not forgiving. In Willa's kitchen, the weekend ritual continued under the slow turning of a ceiling fan with 2 chipped blades. They washed roots in a dented enamel basin. They laid leaves on flour sack towels. Willa kept bottles in a cupboard above the stove, not many, and none with fancy printed labels. Amber glass, blue glass, a few clear ones for oil that needed watching. She showed Hazel how to bruise lavender with the back of a spoon before steeping it, how to keep beeswax from scorching, how to mark a jar with the date and the place, because medicine without memory was only guesswork. Her work table held a brass scale, a tin of muslin squares, a ledger with marbled edges, a chipped porcelain funnel, and a marble mortar heavy enough that Hazel could not move it until she was nearly 16. Willa called the mortar a witness, not because it knew anything, but because it had endured human hands without becoming human itself. Its bowl was white with grey threads, smooth inside from generations of grinding, and darkened near the lip where oils had entered the stone beyond any cleaning. They did not call what they made cures. Willa would not permit that. They made comforts, steepings, balms, careful washes, sachets for linen, oils for hands stiff from winter, teas that asked the body to rest instead of commanding it. Hazel learned ratios before she learned confidence. 1 part dried calendula to 4 parts oil, 6 weeks in a sun-warmed window, strain twice through muslin, heat low, add beeswax only when the oil held its colour clear as late afternoon. She learned that steam could burn before it looked dangerous, that mould could arrive in a jar that smelled perfectly sweet, that some plants helped only when gathered at the right hour and handled with an honest mind. One November afternoon, after rain had kept them indoors, and the whole house smelled of orange peel, pine resin, and wet wool drying near the stove, Willa placed Hazel's hand on the marble mortar and said the sentence Hazel carried longer than any prayer. Never take from a plant, a place, a person unless you have learned what it can survive losing. Willa did not explain it immediately. She let Hazel sit with the words while the rain ticked along the gutter in uneven measures. Then she said that knowledge was not ownership, and skill was not permission. A hillside could be stripped by greedy hands. A person could be emptied by being useful to someone who never said thank you. A remedy made without humility was no remedy at all. Hazel was 14 then, thin as a reed and solemn with the power of being trusted. She copied the sentence into the front of her notebook and underlined only one word: survive. 3 winters later, Willa died in the first week of February, after a cough that became pneumonia and then became silence. There was no hospital drama, no final speech, no room full of reconciled faces. There was only Hazel standing beside the narrow bed while Willa's house settled around them, the stove gone cold because nobody had thought to feed it, the windows silvered with frost from the inside. Willa had lost weight so quietly that even the quilt looked startled by the shape beneath it. After the funeral, relatives arrived with cardboard boxes and the efficient manners of people who had already decided what memory was worth. A cousin took the brass scale. Someone else took the ledger, saying old books sold well if they looked pretty. The amber bottles were wrapped in newspaper and divided between women who had once mocked Willa's weed water at Thanksgiving. Hazel asked for the field bag, the folding knife and the marble mortar, but she was 17 and had no legal claim to anything, and grief made her voice too small. By evening, the house was bare enough to echo. Hazel stood in the kitchen where orange peels had once dried on cotton thread above the stove. On the counter lay a single thing no one had wanted: a cracked pestle, not the marble one that belonged with the mortar, but a wooden practice pestle Willa had given Hazel when her hands were still too slight for stone. It had a dark thumb groove from years of use. Hazel slipped it into her coat sleeve before Lorna came to find her. What followed was not sudden ruin. Sudden ruin would have at least announced itself. Lorna married Warren Pike the next September, a church-going man with neat cuffs, polished shoes, and a way of looking at every room as if checking it for damage. He sold insurance and kept a desk calendar with appointments written in black ink, all the letters upright and severe. In public, he held doors. At home, he adjusted thermostats, counted slices of bread, and made remarks so even-toned they reached the skin late. He did not forbid Hazel's books. He placed them in a box and moved the box to the garage because the kitchen table was for eating. He did not call her foolish. He asked whether she intended to make a living out of roadside weeds. He did not raise his voice when she received a scholarship to the University of Arkansas. He smiled at Lorna and said debt had many costumes, and education was one of the prettier ones. Hazel left anyway. At the university she studied biology with a concentration in plant ecology, then slid toward ethnobotany, the way water finds a patient crack. The campus was large, sunlit, and full of students who knew how to speak from the center of their own lives. Hazel did not. She worked evenings in a dining hall, cleaned lab glass on Sundays, and slept with earplugs because the dormitory hummed all night with laughter, doors, music, and the private ease of people who believed they had arrived somewhere meant for them. Professor Alden Greaves noticed her during her second year. He was the kind of academic who wore linen jackets in warm weather and wool scarves indoors when it was cold. A silver-haired man with careful hands and a voice that made theft sound like mentorship. His office held framed degrees, pressed specimens, and a photograph of him beside a grant donor at a conference in Boston. He praised Hazel's field notes. He said her work had unusual sensitivity, and she kept the phrase folded inside herself for 3 days before she trusted it. Under his supervision, she began a study of regional medicinal plants used historically in the Ozarks for nervous agitation, insomnia, and grief. She did not use Willa's private recipes. She was careful about that line. Instead, she compared oral histories, county medical archives, historical herbals, and chemical profiles from lab samples gathered under permit. She spent weekends riding buses to small libraries, reading brittle newspapers on microfilm, copying advertisements for spring tonics and nerve drops from the 1890s. She learned how many women had practiced healing without putting their names on anything. Greaves encouraged her to write more. Then he asked to keep copies. Then he suggested her language lacked professional polish. By March of her third year, her notes, tables, and early analysis had become part of a conference paper bearing only his name. When Hazel objected, he did not deny it. That was the first thing that frightened her. He sat behind his desk, tapped 2 fingers on a folder, and explained that raw material was not scholarship until someone shaped it. His smile was neither cruel nor warm. It was administrative. Later, when she filed a complaint, the department requested documentation. Greaves produced emails, drafts, meeting notes, and a version of her own work edited so thoroughly it looked as if she had assisted him instead of the other way around. Her lab access was suspended during review. Her scholarship renewal stalled. A minor accusation appeared, phrased delicately, suggesting she had misrepresented data ownership. By the end of April, the school had no place for her that did not require money she could not pay. She returned to Lorna and Warren's house with 1 suitcase, 3 notebooks, the wooden pestle, and a manila envelope containing the letter that said she was not expelled, only administratively withdrawn pending appeal. The difference mattered to the paper. It did not matter at the dinner table. For 2 weeks, Hazel slept on a narrow cot in the laundry room, beneath a shelf of detergent, clothespins, and Warren's labelled boxes of extension cords. Lorna moved around her carefully, making coffee, folding towels, setting plates down without allowing them to touch too sharply. There were moments when Hazel almost spoke. She wanted to say Greaves had stolen from her. She wanted to say she had done everything carefully and it had still been taken, but Warren's chair sat at the end of the table, and his silence reached farther than his hands ever did. The eviction came on May 9th, 2023, just after a rain that left the driveway shining like poured pewter. Hazel remembered the date because the irises beside the porch had opened that morning, purple and yellow throats turned toward the washed light. She had gone to the library to print forms for her appeal, and came back to find her suitcase on the porch, her satchel beside it, and the wooden pestle laid across the top like a small bone. The physical object that undid her was not the suitcase. It was her notebook, the brown grocery paper one from childhood. bent at one corner and sealed inside a freezer bag against the damp. Lorna must have packed it. Lorna must have known. Warren stood inside the screen door, one hand on the frame, his wedding ring bright against the painted wood. You cannot keep making your ruin our weather. 8 words. Not shouted. Not even sharpened. Behind him Lorna stood at the kitchen sink with both hands in dishwater, though no dishes were visible. She did not turn around. A strand of hair had fallen from her clip and stuck against her cheek. Hazel watched her mother lift one hand from the water, then lower it again, slow as a leaf sinking. That was the betrayal, not a sentence, not a locked door. Only the choice to remain facing the sink while her daughter stood outside in the wet May light with her whole life reduced to what could be lifted. Hazel picked up the suitcase. The handle cracked halfway down the porch steps, and she carried it against her chest the rest of the way. For 6 weeks she moved through northwest Arkansas and then beyond it in short, careful distances, spending only when cold or hunger made stubbornness dangerous. She slept first in Bentonville, behind a closed garden center under a rack of plastic trays that smelled of potting soil. She had $31 then, saved from dining hall wages and 1 returned textbook. The next night she took shelter in Rogers at a 24-hour laundromat, sitting upright beside a humming dryer with her satchel looped twice around her ankle. A woman folding children's pajamas gave her a banana without looking directly at her. In Fayetteville, she slept 2 nights in the university library before a security guard recognized that she was not studying. He did not shame her. He only said policy required him to ask her to leave after closing, and his voice held enough regret that she thanked him. She walked to the bus station and spent $8 to get to Springdale, where she found an overhang behind a feed store and woke with chaff in her hair. Her money dropped to $23 and some change. She tried the shelters when pride became a weight with no practical use. In one, the fluorescent lights stayed on all night, and a woman in the next cot whispered numbers in her sleep. In another, a volunteer asked for emergency contacts, and Hazel stood with the pen in her hand until the blank line widened into something she could not cross. She wrote Willa's name, then scratched it out until the paper tore. In Siloam Springs, she washed in a church restroom and mended her skirt with dental floss bought from a dollar store. In Harrison, she ate crackers under the awning of a closed pharmacy while thunder walked along the ridges. Once near Berryville, a farmer found her sleeping in a hay barn and did not call anyone. He stood at the open door, his shape cut from pale dawn, and said she could take the road east if she was heading toward the older hill towns. He left a paper cup of coffee on a fence post and walked away before gratitude could become difficult. Her money thinned with the days, $14, $11, $7, and 82 cents. She kept the $4 bills folded apart in the inner pocket of her satchel, not because they were enough for anything, but because they had survived all the smaller urgencies. She spent coins first, a cup of soup, a stamp for a letter of appeal she never mailed, soap, needle, bread that lasted 3 days because she cut it with Willa's folding knife into slices no wider than patience. By late June, Hazel had learned the names of public libraries the way other travelers learned hotels. Some were brick and formal. Some were converted storefronts with carpet squares and donated magazines. She used their restrooms, their water fountains, their computers when no one was waiting. She read county notices, job boards, municipal pages, and classified listings no one her age seemed to know still existed. Caretaker wanted, estate cleanup, room in exchange for elder care, farm help, no drugs, church rummage, all items priced to move. On a Thursday afternoon in the Eureka Springs Carnegie Public Library, while rain pressed silver fingers against the tall windows, Hazel found the listing that held her still. It had been printed from the county surplus page and taped crookedly to a bulletin board beside notices for piano lessons, grief counseling, and a missing orange cat named Peter. The paper was softened at the corners from damp hands. Across the top, in plain type, it read, County held structure for transfer, historic commercial parcel. Liability waiver reported. Minimum bid, $4. Below that was a parcel number, a street name she did not know, and a description so poor it seemed almost embarrassed to exist. Former apothecary structure. Closed since 1998. No utilities guaranteed. Interior unsafe. Demolition scheduled pending final notice. Buyer assumes all risk. Cash only. Office hours Monday through Friday. Hazel stood before the board while rainwater dripped from the hem of her coat onto the library floor. The word apothecary had the force of a hand laid gently between her shoulders. Not pharmacy, not retail unit. Apothecary, a word with drawers in it. A word with roots and powders, amber bottles and patient scales. A word that had once belonged to people like Willa, and to people before Willa, and to the many unnamed women whose work had been borrowed, mocked, written over, and still somehow kept. She copied the address on the back of a grocery receipt. Her hand did not shake, though the rest of her body had become very cold. At a reading table near the Arkansas history shelf, Hazel unfolded the $4. The bills were soft from being carried against her for weeks. One had a tear mended with transparent tape. One had ink on the corner from a cashier's pen. She smoothed them with the side of her hand and placed them beside her satchel, the wooden pestle, and the notebook that still smelled faintly of freezer plastic and rain. There were many sensible reasons not to go. The building might be gone already. The county clerk might refuse to take her seriously. The property might be dangerous enough to kill her in her sleep. $4 could buy 2 cans of soup, a bus fare partway west, or one more day of not deciding. But sense had not protected her work, her home, or her name. Sense had stood beside the sink with wet hands and said nothing. By closing time, the rain had slowed to a mist. Hazel stepped out beneath the library awning and looked toward the steep streets of Eureka Springs, where houses clung to hillsides as if they had made private agreements with gravity. The town smelled of wet limestone, cedar, exhaust, and something mineral underneath. The old spring water working its way through hidden dark. She had one suitcase with a broken handle, a satchel, a wooden pestle, and $4 kept flat between the pages of a notebook. The next morning, she would walk into the county clerk's office and ask for the condemned apothecary no one wanted. And before the day ended, the first person in many years would hand Hazel a key. The courthouse opened at 8:30, but Hazel was already across the square when the clock in the steeple made its slow argument with the morning fog. She had spent part of the night on a church bench under a covered side porch, not asleep exactly, but surrendered to intervals of darkness while rainwater ticked from the gutter, and a delivery truck backed somewhere down the hill with 3 patient beeps. Her coat had dried stiff at the cuffs. Her shoes held the shape of yesterday's miles. The walk from the library district to the county offices was not far on a map, but Eureka Springs had never been a town that respected straight lines. Streets curved, climbed, broke themselves against limestone and resumed at improbable angles. Houses stood above one another, porch roofs nearly level with someone else's chimneys, and the sidewalks rose in steps where the hill refused to flatten. Hazel passed stone retaining walls slick with moss, iron railings furred with rust, and old stairways that disappeared between buildings as if they were meant for smaller, more secret citizens. 2 days earlier she had come into town by bus as far as Berryville, then ridden the last leg with a woman who cleaned vacation cabins and smelled of lemon oil and cigarette smoke. Before that had been a longer road, patched together from short tickets, borrowed directions, and the kindness of people who did not ask questions all the way to the bottom. She had slept one night in a hay barn outside Green Forest after missing the final ride west, wrapped in her coat beside square bales stacked under a tin roof. The thermometer nailed near the barn door had read 41 degrees at dawn. A horse in the next stall had breathed steadily through the dark, and that living sound had kept panic from closing its fist. Now walking toward the clerk's office, Hazel carried everything close. The suitcase handle had finally given out near a stone stair, so she hugged the case against her hip and let the satchel strap cross her body. Her shoulder ached in a dull line from neck to elbow. Each step made the 4 folded bills in her notebook seem heavier, not because paper had weight, but because a final thing always does. The town was waking with the unhurried precision of places that expected visitors later but belonged to locals first. A bakery propped open its door, letting out the smell of yeast, coffee, and cinnamon still dark from the oven. A narrow bookstore set a cart of used paperbacks beneath an awning, each book covered against the mist with a sheet of clear plastic. At a barber shop, an older man in a white jacket swept yesterday's hair into a little grey drift near the door. The Basin Park Hotel lifted its many-windowed face above the street like a weathered ship caught on land. Farther down, a mineral bath building, long converted to offices and treatment rooms, held a painted sign promising rest in lettering that had faded but not surrendered. There was also a hardware store with green trim, a cafe with lace curtains and a chalkboard menu, a small flower shop displaying buckets of late peonies, a pawn and watch repair counter no wider than a hallway, and a real estate office where glossy photographs of lake houses stared out at people who would never need to ask the county for a condemned building. Hazel noted them all. She had learned to study a town before asking anything from it. A place revealed itself in what it repaired, what it fed, what it sold to strangers, and what it had forgotten to remove. The county clerk's office occupied the lower floor of a brick building set slightly back from the sidewalk, with limestone steps worn hollow in the middle by generations of boots, church shoes, courthouse heels, and winter grit. The brass handrail was cold under Hazel's palm. A notice board stood beside the entrance, sealed behind glass and crowded with tax dates, meeting agendas, road closures, and a yellowing announcement about proper disposal of storm debris. The same surplus listing was tacked inside, flatter here, more official, and for a moment Hazel felt the odd embarrassment of seeing her private hope posted in public. Inside, the air changed. The room smelled of paper, floor wax, damp wool, and the faint dust of heating ducts. Fluorescent lights hummed above two service counters. Behind them stood metal shelves loaded with deed books, parcel files, binders, receipt boxes, and manila folders whose tabs curled from years of being touched. A map of the county hung on the far wall under glass, its roads drawn in red and black, its waterways thin blue lines threading through hills. Near the door sat 3 wooden chairs, each polished at the front edge by waiting hands. Hazel lowered her suitcase beside one chair but did not sit. Sitting felt too close to permission. She stood with her satchel against her hip and watched a printer cough out a page behind the counter. A ceiling fan turned above them, not fast enough to cool anything, only enough to stir the corners of paper into small, restless movements. The woman behind the counter did not look up right away. She was finishing a notation in a ledger with a black pen, her handwriting compact and upright. Her hair was the colour of iron filings, cut blunt below the chin, and she wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse button to the throat. Her glasses hung from a beaded chain, not decorative but practical, the beads dark brown like coffee beans. On the counter in front of her sat a brass nameplate engraved with MRS, Evelyn Pritchard, County Clerk. When she did look up, she took Hazel in without surprise. Not kindly, not unkindly. Exactly. "Morning," she said. "Good morning, ma'am." Hazel's voice sounded thinner in the office than it had outside. She reached into the back of her notebook, removed the grocery receipt, and slid it across the counter with 2 fingers. "I came about this parcel." Mrs. Pritchard put on her glasses and read the number. Her mouth made no shape of approval. She turned to the computer, typed slowly, then opened a drawer and found a file before the machine had finished thinking. That told Hazel something. The woman already knew the parcel. Perhaps everyone in the office did. "The former apothecary, Mrs. Pritchard said. "Yes, ma'am." "You walked here?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk's eyes moved once toward the suitcase on the floor, then returned to the file. She opened it with a practiced thumb. Inside were photographs, notices, inspection papers, and a deed transfer packet clipped with a black binder clip. The top photograph showed a storefront under bare trees, its windows clouded, its sign hanging at one corner. Even in the poor printout, Hazel recognized the posture of abandonment. A building could look ashamed. This one did. Mrs. Pritchard removed a form and set it flat on the counter. "You understand this is not a rental?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no guarantee of water, heat, Electric service. Sewer connection. Saw structural safety. Yes. Ma'am, you understand the county is not liable if the roof gives way, if the floor fails, if an animal has nested inside, if you discover mold, lead paint, asbestos, snakes, anything else waiting in there. Yes, ma'am. You understand the transfer is final after recording. Yes, ma'am. You understand that if you take possession and fail to secure the building, the demolition order can still proceed under nuisance rules. Yes,
Ma'am.
The repetition steadied Hazel. Each warning was a nail placed in a board. She could see them, she could count them. The world had wounded her most when it used soft language for hard things. Mrs. Pritchard did not. No utilities guaranteed. Interior unsafe. Final after recording. The words were not warm, but they were honest. And Hazel had developed a taste for honest words that bordered on hunger. The clerk leaned back in her chair, folding both hands over the file. You are very young. Hazel kept her eyes on the counter's worn edge. There were grooves there from decades of papers slid back and forth, a faint grey polish where sleeves had rested. Yes, ma'am? And you have seen the property? No, ma'am. Only the notice. Mrs. Pritchard removed her glasses. Without them her face looked less severe, though no less careful. Fine lines spread from the corners of her eyes like roads on a map. It is not on the tourist walk, she said. It is not one of those pretty restorations with iron balconies and painted trim. It sits low against the north slope where the damp stays. The last owner walked away, and the one before him used the front for storage. We have had raccoons reported, and a tree came down behind the chimney about 6 years ago. There is a spring run nearby which is good in summer and troublesome in winter. It has not paid taxes properly in a long time. That is how it came here. Hazel listened as if receiving instructions for handling a volatile compound. Damp slope, storage, raccoons, tree, spring run, trouble in winter. None of it pushed her back. Instead, the warnings gave the building shape. A place became less frightening when its dangers were named. I understand, Hazel said. Mrs. Pritchard looked toward the window where mist had begun to soften the parked cars outside. Somewhere in the back room, a phone rang twice, then stopped. The minimum bid is cash, she said. $4. Not a penny less. Though I do not suppose that is the problem. Hazel opened her notebook. She took out the bills and set them on the counter one by one, smoothing each before placing the next. The taped bill, the marked bill, the 2 cleaner ones. Together they looked both pitiful and ceremonial. Mrs. Pritchard did not touch them immediately. Her gaze rested on Hazel's hands, which were chapped narrow and reddened at the knuckles from public restroom soap and cold rain. Finally, the clerk picked up the bills and aligned their edges with a tap. I will need identification. Hazel produced her student card, expired only recently, and a state ID with an address she no longer possessed. Mrs. Pritchard examined both. If she noticed the old address, she made no comment. She photocopied them, placed the copies in the file, and turned the deed packet toward Hazel. The signing took longer than Hazel expected. There were waivers, acknowledgements, a transfer form, a tax statement, and a page that seemed to say in 3 different ways that nobody had promised her anything except the burden she was accepting. Mrs. Pritchard marked each line with a removable blue tab. Hazel signed carefully, using her full legal name, because a person without much else could still write herself down in exact letters. The pen was heavier than it looked. Its barrel was chained to the counter with silver links, and the chain dragged softly each time Hazel moved to the next signature line. The sound brought her back to Willa's kitchen for no sensible reason, to muslin being pulled from a drawer, to the click of glass bottles touching in a cupboard. There were sounds that did not resemble one another, and yet belonged to the same inward country. When the last page was signed, Mrs. Pritchard gathered the packet, squared it against the counter, and carried it to a side desk where a brass embossing stamp waited. It was larger than Hazel expected, with a curved handle darkened by years of palms. The clerk slid the first document into place and pressed down. The stamp gave a heavy, satisfying clunk, lifting a raised county seal from the paper. She repeated the motion on the next page, and the next clunk. Turn, clunk, turn. Each sound made the transaction less imaginary. Mrs. Pritchard returned with a receipt, the deed copies, and a key attached to a paper tag by brown string. The key was plain steel, newer than the building, but old enough to have lost its shine. On the tag, someone had written the parcel number in pencil and then traced it again in pen when the pencil faded. Hazel accepted it with both hands before she could stop herself. "You will go down Spring Street," Mrs. Pritchard said, taking a town map from a stack near the printer. She marked the route with a yellow highlighter, past the hotel, then keep right where the road bends. You will pass the old bathhouse and a stone wall with Virginia creeper. Turn on to North Main for a stretch, then take Mill Hollow Road where it drops. Do not miss that turn. It looks like a driveway if you're not paying attention. The shop sits back from the road behind 2 black walnut trees. There is no mailbox. The sign is still there, if the wind has not finally had its way. Hazel folded the map once. Then again. "Thank you." Mrs. Pritchard did not release the receipt at once. Her fingers rested lightly on its corner. "What was your grandmother's name?" Hazel blinked. The question had entered the room so quietly that for a moment it seemed to have come from somewhere else. "My grandmother, or someone older in your family?" The clerk tapped the deed where Hazel's surname appeared. "Bell is not rare, but it is not as common here as Smith or Johnson. I knew a Bell woman once, not well. She used to come in to look through property records and old medical licenses, wore a brown hat in winter, carried a field bag." Hazel's throat moved before any sound arrived. "That was probably my aunt, Willa Bell." Mrs. Pritchard's expression changed in a way too small to name. Not a smile, not recognition alone. Something that settled. "Willaroo," she said. Yes, that was it. Hazel held the counter edge. "She came here several times years ago." Mrs. Pritchard looked toward the shelves behind her, as if the old visits might still be filed somewhere under a letter or a number. She asked about apothecaries, spring houses, herb sellers, midwives. The sort of things people forget until someone wants them. She was particular, did not waste words. "No," Hazel said. She did not. The clerk's thumb moved over the corner of the receipt, making the paper whisper. "She once corrected a notice we had on file. Said we had written patent medicine shop where the older ledger said Apothecary and Botanical Rooms. I remember because she was right, and because nobody had cared enough to be right about it before." For the first time since Hazel had entered the office, the room seemed to have depth beyond its counters and files. Willa had stood here. Willa's shoes had touched this same floor wax. Her hand may have rested where Hazel's hand now rested, square and speckled, one finger perhaps stained green from crushed stems. The thought did not comfort in any simple way. It widened the air. Mrs. Pritchard slid the receipt fully across. "I cannot say she had any connection to that property," she said. "I only remember the name. Memory is not evidence." "No, ma'am. But sometimes it is a lamp." Hazel looked up. The clerk had already lowered her eyes to the file, as if embarrassed by having said more than the office required. She placed Hazel's $4 in a cash drawer, wrote a receipt number, and stamped paid in red ink over a line that had been waiting many years for the pressure. Then she opened a lower drawer and removed a narrow envelope. "This copy is for your records. Keep it dry." She paused. "The original will be recorded. Come back next week if you need a certified copy." Hazel nodded. Mrs. Pritchard reached toward a mug near her computer, then stopped and instead took a pencil from a cup. On the town map, she drew a small X beside the route's end. Do not go in after dark if the floor feels soft. Yes, ma'am. And if there are stairs to a cellar, do not trust them. Yes, ma'am. And do not sleep under a ceiling stain. Hazel almost smiled, but not enough to become visible. No, ma'am. The clerk studied her one last time, and in that look Hazel felt the peculiar mercy of being assessed accurately without being dismissed. Mrs. Pritchard did not bless the decision. She did not soften the risk. She only gave the map, the receipt, the warning, and the key. That was more useful than pity. Outside the mist had thinned, leaving the town rinsed and uncertain under a pale sky. Hazel sat on the courthouse step long enough to transfer the deed copies into the driest part of her satchel. She placed the key in the inner pocket where the $4 had been. The absence of the bills made the pocket feel hollow, but the key made a different promise. Heavier and colder, the walk to the property began with descent. Spring Street carried her past storefronts that were still arranging themselves for the day. A woman watered hanging ferns outside a gift shop. 2 men unloaded crates behind a restaurant, their breath showing faintly in the morning chill. From an upstairs balcony came the smell of bacon and coffee. Hazel had eaten nothing but half a roll saved from the day before, and the smell entered her body with a sharpness that made her stop beside a lamppost until it passed. She followed Mrs. Pritchard's yellow line, past the hotel with its deep porches, past a shop selling bath salts, soaps, and postcards with old photographs of people in white linen drinking spring water from cups, past a stone wall where Virginia creeper had begun its summer climb, each leaf still bright from rain. The town narrowed as she walked, then loosened. Tourists' signs gave way to service doors, gravel pull-offs, and back porches stacked with firewood. On North Main, a pickup rolled past and slowed. The driver, a man in a seed cap, lifted 2 fingers from the wheel. Hazel lifted her hand in return because refusal would have required more confidence than she possessed. A brown dog followed her for half a block, not barking, only interested. Its ribs showed faintly under wet fur. When Hazel stopped, it stopped. When she began again, it came along until a woman called from a porch, "Mabel, leave that girl be," and the dog turned with a sigh of obedience. Mill Hollow Road did look like a driveway. The turn slipped down between trees, its sign half hidden by honeysuckle and a leaning utility pole. The asphalt gave way to cracked pavement patched with gravel, then to a road that seemed maintained by habit rather than budget. Water ran along one edge in a shallow ditch. The air cooled quickly. Hillsides rose close on both sides, thick with oak, cedar, walnut, and the underbrush of early summer, all of it breathing damp green into the hollow. Hazel passed 3 houses. The first had a chain-link fence and tomato cages made from bent wire. The second was a narrow white house with blue shutters and a porch swing moving slightly, though no one sat in it. The third was brick, newer, with a satellite dish and a row of plastic flamingos faded almost white. A woman at that mailbox paused with envelopes in her hand and watched Hazel pass, not suspiciously, not welcomingly, the simple watching of someone noticing a story at its beginning and deciding not to enter yet. After that came a stretch of trees. The 2 black walnuts appeared first, exactly as Mrs. Pritchard had said. They stood near the road like sentries too patient to be ceremonial, their trunks dark and furrowed, their branches meeting above a narrow path. The ground beneath them was littered with last year's husks, blackened and split, staining the soil with old bitterness. Beyond them sat the apothecary. It was smaller than Hazel had imagined and larger than the photograph had allowed. The front measured perhaps 20 feet across, with a single door set between 2 display windows, one buckled inward, the other filmed with dust so thick it held the pale reflection of trees. The walls were of local limestone on the lower half, and weathered clapboard above, painted once in a green so dark it now looked nearly black where rain had preserved it under the eaves. The roof pitched steeply, cedar shakes layered under patches of tin where someone had tried repairs without finishing the thought. A brick chimney rose from the back, leaned slightly east, and wore a cap crooked enough to seem tired. The sign hung above the door by one chain. The other chain had broken and left the board tilted downward like a bowed head. Most of the paint had peeled away, but several letters remained under lichen and dirt. Bellwether Botanical Rooms, not Bell. Bellwether. Hazel stood with the map still in her hand and read it twice. The word had nothing to do with her. And yet for one foolish, human second, the beginning of it caught at her like a burr. A narrow porch ran across the front, its boards cupped and silvered. The step nearest the door had cracked through the middle. Ferns grew along the foundation where water gathered, and a strand of bittersweet had climbed one corner, threading itself under a loose clapboard. To the left, nearly swallowed by grass, was a stone trough fed by a pipe that dripped clear water one bead at a time. Behind the building, the hill rose steeply, crowded with walnut, dogwood, and cedar. Somewhere out of sight, water moved over stone with a sound too faint to be called a creak and too persistent to be ignored. Hazel set down the suitcase. Her arms trembled from the relief of not carrying it. The key stuck at first. She held the knob with one hand and worked the key slowly with the other, careful not to force what might break. The lock resisted, then gave with a dry internal scrape. When she pushed, the door opened only 4 inches before catching on something inside. Hazel leaned her shoulder against it. Wood dragged across wood, a drift of leaves, plaster dust, and a fallen strip of trim moved unwillingly, and the door widened enough for her to enter sideways. The smell met her first. Not one smell, but layers. Wet wood, dust, mouse droppings, old paper, cold ashes. Dried herbs so faint they might have been memory inventing mercy. Beneath it all lay the mineral smell she had noticed in town. Spring water moving through stones somewhere under the hill. The air was colder than outside and motionless except where the open door disturbed it. Light entered reluctantly through the clouded windows. It crossed the front room in dull bands, revealing oak shelves along both walls, their surfaces grey with dust and sagging under the remains of jars, tins, broken boxes, and folded paper packets. Cobwebs joined the upper shelves to the ceiling in long, soft hammocks. A sales counter stood to the right, its glass front cracked but intact, with small drawers behind it marked in faded ink. Chamomile, comfrey, horehound, motherwort, slippery elm, labels written by a hand that cared whether letters could be read. The floorboards near the door complained under Hazel's weight, but they held. She tested each step before committing to it, placing her foot near the edges where boards were more likely supported by joists. Willa had taught her that about porches after one had given way under a neighbour. Wood speaks first if you let it. Hazel listened. A bell above the door hung without its clapper. The silence where its sound should have been made, the room feel watched. She moved no farther than necessary at first. To the left stood a round table overturned on its side. A wooden chair had collapsed beneath a shelf, its rungs scattered like bones. On the counter lay a ledger swollen with damp. Pages fused at the corners. Hazel touched only the cover. Her fingertip came away dark. The back room waited behind a half-open door whose frosted glass panel had cracked diagonally but not fallen. Painted on it in letters nearly erased were the words preparations and private consultation. Hazel stood before it longer than she intended. The phrase private consultation carried an intimacy that modern offices had flattened into intake forms and waiting rooms. Here perhaps people had brought sleeplessness, tremors, grief, bad nerves, infants who would not settle, men with hands split from quarry work, women with headaches nobody believed. Perhaps they had stood where Hazel now stood, uncertain and hoping not to be made foolish. She opened the door. The back workroom was narrower, with one high window facing the slope. The glass had cracked and rain had entered there, darkening the wall below in a long stain shaped like a hanging cloth. A workbench ran along the left side, built of thick oak planks scarred by knives, heat, and years of use. Above it hung peg rails, with only a few tools remaining: a bent spoon, a small sieve, a rusted pair of shears, a funnel green with corrosion. On the right stood a tall cabinet with many shallow drawers, some missing knobs, some labelled with paper browned to the colour of tea. At the room's centre sat a square table so heavy it had not shifted when everything else declined. On that table was the marble mortar. Hazel did not approach it immediately. She stood in the doorway, aware of her pulse in the hollow behind her knees. The mortar was broader than Willa's had been, with a thick lip and grey veins running through the stone like weather inside milk. It was dusty, but not broken. Beside it lay no pestle. Only a circular mark in the dust suggested where one may once have rested. The sight struck too directly, so she turned away. Practical matters came first. Roof, floor, animals, water. A safe corner. She walked the perimeter of the back room, testing boards, noting holes, avoiding the darker patches near the stained wall. In one corner she found a raccoon nest made from shredded paper and leaves, long abandoned. In another, a stack of wooden crates had collapsed into a soft slope. She checked the chimney from below and saw daylight only where there should have been sky at the top, which meant it was at least not fully blocked. The hearth was narrow, set into the back wall, with ashes packed hard and pale inside. The front room would be safer for the night because the floor there felt drier. Hazel dragged leaves away from a corner beside the counter using a broken board as a broom. The work took longer than it should have. She was weak from hunger and the walk, and each time she bent, small dark points gathered at the edge of her sight. She stopped, drank from the bottle she had filled at the library, and waited until the room returned to itself. From her satchel she removed what she owned that could serve as bedding: a thin sweater, 2 shirts, a flour sack towel from Willa's house, and the coat she would still need over her. She placed the suitcase against the door, not to lock it, but to slow anything that tried to enter. She did not yet trust the back room, so she kept the key in her inner pocket and the deed beneath her folded clothes. Late afternoon faded without colour. The apothecary changed with the light. Shelves grew taller, corners deepened. The cracked display windows gathered the shapes of trees and made them seem closer than they were. Outside, a bird called once from the walnut branches, and the sound entered the room cleanly through the broken seam above the door. Somewhere behind the building, water continued moving over stone. Hazel ate the last half of the roll slowly, taking smaller bites than hunger wanted. She found 3 peppermints in the bottom of the satchel, softened at the edges, and saved 2. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the counter and took out the wooden pestle. It fit her hand the same way it always had, thumb finding the dark groove without instruction. The first night in any abandoned place is not sleep, but negotiation. Hazel learned this before midnight. The building spoke in ticks, sighs, drips, and long wooden adjustments. Something small moved inside the wall near the front window and then went still. A branch brushed the roof. Once a sound like a footstep came from the back room, but after a long while she understood it as water dropping into a metal pan or pail she had not yet seen. The mind, when frightened, assigns a body to every sound. The building had many sounds, but not all sounds were warnings. Cold rose through the floorboards after dark. Hazel put on both shirts, wrapped the sweater around her feet, and wore the coat over her shoulders like a blanket. Her hip ached where the boards pressed bone. She shifted again, then accepted discomfort as part of the room's asking price. Through the display window, between dust and reflected shelves, she could see a fragment of sky. Clouds moved there, slow and low. No stars. Near midnight, a car passed on Mill Hollow Road, its headlights sliding across the front windows in 2 pale bars. The light touched the shelves, the counter, the dangling bell, the labels on the drawers, and then the back door with its cracked glass. For 1 second, the whole shop appeared almost ready to open. Not clean, not repaired, but visible. Then the car went on, and darkness returned with the patience of something unoffended. Hazel lay down at last with the wooden pestle under her hand and the key against her ribs. She did not pray. Prayer had begun to feel like a language other people spoke fluently in public and forgot privately at sinks, desks, and committee tables. Instead, she named what she could hear: water, wood, wind, her own breath. Naming did not rescue her, but it placed each fear in a separate jar. Toward morning, the cold deepened and then loosened. The black windows turned grey. A line of light found the floorboards and showed the dust exactly as it was, not as night had made it. Hazel opened her eyes to the bottom shelf across from her, where 3 jars still stood behind the grime. One held nothing. One held a curl of dried root. One, sealed with a dark cork, contained some pale powder settled at an angle. as if it too had slept unevenly for years. She sat up slowly. Her back hurt. Her mouth tasted of dust. Her hands were stiff and dirty. The building had not become safe. It had not become kind. It had only remained standing through the night, and so had she. The shop was not empty. It had been waiting. By the third morning, Hazel knew which boards would bear her weight and which ones wanted to argue first. She had made a map of the apothecary on the back of a discarded county envelope, not with straight lines and measurements yet, but with warnings, a soft patch near the left display window, a split board behind the sales counter, 3 strong planks beside the east shelves, one loud board between the front room and the door marked for consultation, a board that gave out a long complaining note even under careful feet. She marked it with a little X and stepped over it as if it were sleeping. The first day had been for safety, which meant she touched almost nothing that did not need moving. She opened both front windows as far as they would consent, propping one with a broken drawer and the other with a length of trim. The air changed slowly, as if the building had forgotten how to exhale. Dust lifted from shelves and crossed the room in flat morning light. A dead wasp fell from inside a curtain of webbing and landed on the counter with a dry click. Hazel swept leaves and plaster into piles, using a broom she found behind the door, though half the bristles had surrendered to mice. Water was the first problem that required leaving. The stone trough outside held a thin run from the hill pipe, clear but edged with leaves, walnut husks and a green slick that made Hazel cautious. She followed the pipe uphill until it disappeared under a limestone shelf where water came out colder than the air, bead by bead, from a rusted nipple someone had set into the stone long before modern plumbing had become an assumption. She did not drink from it yet. Willa had taught her that clear water could still carry what the eye forgave. Instead, Hazel filled her bottle in town at the library and carried it back under her coat, rationing each swallow until her tongue felt made of cloth. Behind the shop she found the outhouse, listing but still upright beneath a cedar tree. Its door hung from one hinge, and a family of paper wasps had begun a grey nest under the eave, no bigger than a plum. Hazel stood back and watched their traffic. They had the clean, deliberate purpose of creatures who had never needed permission. She left them alone and used the edge of the woods until she could decide what could be repaired and what should be respected from a distance. The second day she cleared the front room enough to make a path from door to counter. Then from counter to the rear workroom, she moved broken glass with a piece of cardboard. She tied cloth around her mouth when sweeping near the low shelves where mouse droppings had dried into dark grains. Every motion had to be thought through with the body, not with panic. Lift from the knees. Test before leaning. Do not pull what might be holding something else together. Do not stand beneath a stain. Do not trust silence too quickly. The third day brought rain again, and rain revealed the building's truth more honestly than sun. Water entered above the back chimney in steady intervals, falling into an old galvanized pan already placed below the leak by someone who had known the problem years earlier and then left before solving it. Another drip found the sill under the cracked workroom window. The front room stayed drier than Hazel expected, though damp crept along the lower stones like a tide. She marked each leak on the envelope map with tiny blue circles made from a library pen. By then she had also learned the sounds outside. The dog named Mabel passed once each afternoon and sniffed under the porch before deciding Hazel was less interesting than whatever lived in the ditch. A neighbour's truck went out at 6:40 and returned after 4. The creak under the hill became louder after rain and then subsided into a private mutter. At night, the walnuts dropped last year's loose husks from high branches, each one landing with a dull thud that no longer made Hazel sit upright. On the 4th morning she walked into town because need had become more precise than fear. The hardware store with green trim sat between the cafe and the watch repair counter, its front windows crowded with seed packets, galvanized buckets, lantern mantles, work gloves, and a hand-lettered sign that said "Pipe cut, wheel you wait." The bell above the door still had its voice. It rang once when Hazel entered, a clear sound that made 3 men near the nail bins turn their heads, then returned to their own business after measuring her as belonging to no urgent category. The store smelled of oil, rope, dry cedar shavings, metal filings, and the mineral dust of sacks stacked near the back. Narrow aisles ran between shelves built higher than Hazel could reach. Masonry tools hung beside pruning shears. Glass jars of screws sat in rows behind the counter, their lids written on in black marker. A rotating rack held seed packets whose bright pictures of beans, zinnias, and radishes looked almost indecently optimistic. The man behind the counter was broad through the shoulders but stooped slightly, as if years of leaning over invoices had trained his frame to bend before his mind agreed. His hair was white and cropped close. One eyebrow had a scar through it, making a permanent break in the line. He wore a canvas apron with Holloway hardware embroidered above the pocket. Though the thread had frayed enough to turn the name pale, his hands were large, nicked, and slow, with half-moons of clean wear at the nails. He looked at Hazel's shoes first, then her coat, then the list she had folded in her hand. "What are you fixing?" he said. Not quite a question. Hazel hesitated. She had learned that saying too much could invite advice she could not afford. Saying too little could invite suspicion. The old apothecary on Mill Hollow Road. The men near the nail bins stopped pretending not to listen. The hardware owner removed his pencil from behind his ear and set it on the counter. "Is that so?" "Yes." "You buy it from the county?" "Yes." "For the taxes?" "For the transfer." His eyes settled on her face longer than politeness required. But he did not smile in that way people sometimes smiled when a young person had made a mistake too large to correct. "I am Everett Holloway," he said. "My father owned this store before me." His father sold nails out of a wagon before there was a proper floor under anybody's boots. "What do you need first?" The kindness of the question nearly undid her because it was not softened. It did not say poor girl. It did not say impossible. It asked for order. Hazel unfolded the list. The paper had gone soft at the creases from being opened and closed in damp air. "I need to make it safe enough not to get worse while I learn what else has to be done." "That is a better answer than most." Everett took the list and read it without moving his lips. He crossed out 2 items, circled 1, and wrote sizes beside 3 others. Then he turned and pulled a yellow paperback from a shelf behind him. It was sun-faded and thick, with a cracked spine and a title that read, "Old House Repair for Owner Builders." The cover showed a man on a ladder, hammer lifted, looking far more confident than any person on a ladder had a right to look. "This is outdated in places," Everett said, "which means some of it is still useful." "You can borrow it?" "I cannot pay to borrow." "I did not ask you to." Hazel rested both hands on the counter edge. "I do not have credit. You have a name. That has not been worth much lately." Everett's broken eyebrow lifted by a fraction. "It is worth enough to write down." He opened a ledger from beneath the counter. Not a computer screen. Not a tablet. A real ledger with blue lines and red margins. The cover worn where many hands had dragged it forward. He turned to a clean page and wrote her name, then the property description. "I run house accounts for half this hollow," he said. "Some pay Fridays, some pay when calves sell. One man pays every October in walnuts, which I do not recommend as a system. You buy only what keeps you alive, and the roof from opening wider. We will not start with paint. Paint is for liars and celebrations." The smallest sound escaped Hazel, almost a laugh, but worn down by disuse. "Yes." "Do not call me sir unless I start acting like one." "Yes." "Mr. Holloway." "That will do." He gathered supplies with a method that seemed born from both memory and respect for scarcity. 1 pair of leather work gloves from a sale bin, because Hazel's hands were already split at the knuckles. 1 canvas dust mask, and 2 paper ones. A stiff wire chimney brush sized after he asked about the flue and frowned at her uncertain measurement. 12 feet of fiberglass rod in 3 sections, a small cold chisel, a wooden-handled wire brush, a 5-in-1 scraper, a cheap flashlight with 2 batteries included, a bundle of contractor trash bags, a roll of cotton sash cord, though he put it aside after saying windows could wait, a box of 8D galvanized nails, a pound of 16D common nails, 1 blue tarp, 10 by 12 feet, patched with tape on one edge and therefore half price. He read each price aloud as he wrote it. Gloves $1.50 from the damaged bin. Dust mask 89 cents. Paper masks 30 cents each. Chimney brush $6.75. Rod sections $2 each. Chisel $1.95. Wire brush 75 cents. Scraper $1.10. Flashlight $2.49. Batteries included, so no separate charge. Trash bags $1.25. Nails $1.40 for the smaller box, 90 cents for the pound of commons. Tarp $3 flat because patching tape was no crime. The total, even discounted, climbed beyond what Hazel could imagine owing a stranger. Everett wrote the sum in the ledger anyway, then slid the pencil toward her. Sign there. And write the date. Hazel did. Her handwriting looked steadier than she felt. As he packed the items into a cardboard box that had once held canning lids, Everett added 2 things without writing them down: a stub of carpenter's pencil and 3 folded pages torn from an old store circular. Blank on one side. For notes, he said when she looked at them. I will pay for those too. No. You will use them. One of the men near the nail bins muttered something about that place being fit only for possums. Everett turned his head. Not sharply, but enough. Possums mind their business, he said. The man found interest in a drawer of washers. Hazel carried the box back against her ribs, stopping twice on the climb because its weight pressed the breath out of her. At the cafe, a woman setting out a chalkboard paused and watched her pass. Hazel kept walking. The smell of biscuits followed her half a block like a hand she could not afford to take. Back at the shop, she set the box on the counter and opened the repair book to the chapter on chimneys. Everett had marked it with a torn receipt. The first instruction was not to build a fire until the flue was inspected, cleaned, and checked for nests or obstruction. Hazel read the chapter twice while standing because sitting made sleep come too quickly. Then she tied the dust mask around her face, put on the leather gloves, and began. The hearth was packed with old ash hardened by damp into a pale grey cake. She removed it with a broken scoop, lifting each load into a metal bucket she found under the counter. Beneath the ash were charred ends of wood, mouse bones fine as sewing needles, and flakes of soot that stained the gloves black. She worked slowly. When the bucket became too heavy, she carried it outside and dumped it in a shallow pit behind the building, away from roots and dry leaves. Next came the damper. It was rusted half open. Hazel lay on her back with the flashlight held between chin and shoulder, looking up into the black throat of the chimney. A smell descended from it, sharp and bitter, like burned wood, whetstone, and old rain. Creosote lined the lower flue in ridges glossy as tar. Farther up, something pale blocked part of the light, nesting material perhaps, or fallen mortar. She did not climb to the roof. The roof was not yet a surface to trust. Instead, she worked from below as the book described, fixing the chimney brush to the first rod, then the second, then feeding it upward with steady pressure. The first shove dislodged a shower of soot that fell across her mask, hair, shoulders, and the floor around her. She coughed anyway, hard enough that her ribs hurt. Then she tied a damp flour sack towel over the mask and tried again. Up. Twist. Down. Tap loose. Up. Twist. Down. The brush scraped with an ugly, useful sound. Creosote fell in flakes, then in heavier chunks that struck the damper and broke apart. She stopped every few minutes to clear the hearth, not wanting the mess to bury the opening she needed to see. When the rod met resistance, she did not force it. She backed down, turned the brush, and pressed again at an angle until something above shifted. A rain of dry leaves came down first, then twigs, then a mass of old nesting grass packed with grey fur. No fresh smell, no living animal, only an abandoned claim. By noon, her arms shook from holding the rods overhead. By 2, her shoulders burned. By 4, the light in the room had gone flat, and she had cleaned only what she could reach from below. She read the chapter again and found a paragraph about mirror inspection, so she took the cracked hand mirror from her suitcase, held it inside the firebox with the flashlight angled across it, and looked for daylight. A thin wavering patch appeared high above, not clear, but open. The work took 6 hours the first day and 3 more the next. She brushed until the worst ridges were gone. She scraped the damper with the wire brush until it moved another inch. She checked the firebox for loose brick and found 2 joints where mortar had powdered away under her touch. Those she marked with chalk and did not disturb. A chimney could be cleaner and still not safe. The book repeated that. Everett had written in the margin years ago, or someone had, "Small fire first, never trust an old throat." On the evening of the 5th day, Hazel built the first fire no larger than a hat. She used dry twigs gathered from beneath the cedar where rain had not reached, a twist of paper from a ruined receipt, and 3 narrow sticks split from a broken crate. She opened the damper fully. She opened the front door 2 inches. Then she struck 1 match. The flame took the paper, hesitated at the twigs, then found a thread of resin in the cedar and lifted itself with a soft click. Smoke gathered in the firebox, uncertain, then leaned upward. Hazel crouched before it, one hand on the hearthstone, watching not the flame but the smoke. It moved into the chimney in a narrow grey ribbon. A little entered the room and made her eyes water, but most went where it was asked to go. She fed the fire 1 stick at a time, never enough to roar. Heat slowly entered the bricks, then the air. The room did not become warm. It became less cold, which was a more honest blessing. Her first hot meal was made in a tin cup balanced on 2 bricks at the hearth edge. Water, a heel of bread torn small, a pinch of salt Everett had tucked into the hardware box without mention, and the last of the crackers softened until they became something like soup. She ate it with the bent spoon from the workroom peg rail after boiling the spoon first and wiping it with cloth. The meal had no beauty. It had steam. That was enough. After that, the building began to yield its inventory. Hazel approached the rear workroom as if entering an archive rather than a ruin. She started at the door and moved clockwise, listing each object on Everett's scrap paper, because naming things kept greed and fear from making a mess of them. On the left wall, workbench, oak, 6 feet 9 inches long, 2 feet deep, stained but sound except at rear corner. Peg rail, walnut, 7 pegs remaining, 4 empty holes. Tools, bent spoon, copper funnel, wire sieve torn at edge, rusted shears, iron hook, cracked glass stirring rod, small wooden mallet with wormholes. Under the bench, 3 crates collapsed, 1 crate intact. Contents of intact crate, corks hardened and dry, muslin scraps, 2 cracked amber bottles, 1 blue bottle unbroken but clouded inside. Paper labels printed with Bellwether Botanical Rooms, Spring Street Road, Eureka Springs. Hazel paused over the labels. The address named an older road before the town's practical renaming had done its work. She placed the labels between 2 dry boards under a stone to flatten them. Right wall, tall cabinet, 36 drawers. She numbered them in pencil because many labels could no longer be trusted. Drawer 1 empty except dust. Drawer 2 chamomile heads, long past use but still faintly apple sweet when crushed. Drawer 3 burdock root, petrified into twists. Drawer 4 mouse nest, removed with gloves. Drawer 5 glass vials wrapped in old newspaper from 1932. Drawer 6 beeswax, cracked and pale, smelling faintly of honey when warmed in her hand. Drawer 7 powdered something unlabeled, discarded carefully into a sealed bag. Drawer 8 dried rose hips, dark as old beads. She did not taste anything. She did not trust age, labels, or longing. The upper shelves held ledgers ruined beyond reading, a stack of order forms, a box of cork-lined tin lids, 2 ceramic jars marked externally but empty within, and a framed certificate so stained she could make out only the words registered and botanical. On the high window ledge she found 3 dead lady beetles, a bird feather, and a strip of wallpaper curled into a tube. In the corner near the rain stain sat a small iron stove disconnected from its pipe, its belly rusted but not eaten through. Beside it lay a coil of copper tubing green at the bends. Then came the centre table. Hazel had avoided it for days because the marble mortar on top of it seemed too much like Willa's kitchen and not enough like survival. Avoidance, however, was not a method. On the sixth afternoon, after the first small fire had proven the chimney willing, she cleared the table's edges with a damp cloth and catalogued what surrounded the mortar: a cracked porcelain tile used as a trivet, 3 circles burned into the wood, a scale weight marked 2 ounces, a scrap of paper with a recipe fragment, lavender tops, skullcap, oat straw, steep covered, no boil, a stain shaped like a spilled moon. The mortar itself sat slightly off-centre. It was too large for casual work, nearly 16 inches across at the lip, carved from marble with grey veining, its bowl deep enough to hold both Hazel's hands cupped together. Dust gathered inside it in a soft skin. The outer surface had been touched so often that even grime could not hide the polish around its waist. Hazel wiped the lip with a damp cloth, then the inside, then the base where it met the table. Something about the sound changed. The cloth moving over marble made a dull hush, but when her knuckles brushed the table just beyond the mortar, she heard a faint, higher note. She stopped. The room held still around her. Hazel tapped the tabletop to the left. Solid oak, low and dense. She tapped to the right. Same. She tapped near the front edge and heard the heavy note of thick wood. Then she tapped directly beneath the mortar's overhanging shadow, as close as she could reach without moving it. A hollow tick answered. Not large, not theatrical. A small difference. The kind Willa would have heard and said nothing about until Hazel noticed too. Hazel removed everything else from the table. She leaned close, listening as she tapped again with one knuckle, then with the wooden pestle, lightly. The hollow space seemed to be under the centre panel, but the mortar covered most of it. She tried to shift the marble bowl with both hands. It did not move. She braced her hip against the table and pushed. Nothing. She tried turning it. The mortar held its place with the stubbornness of stone and time. Weight test. She wrote on the scrap. Too heavy for daily use. Table sag. No visible sag. She knelt beneath the table with the flashlight. The underside was shadowed, cross-braced with oak supports. Spiderwebs trembled in the beam. At first she saw nothing but wood darkened by age. Then near the centre she found 4 screws that did not match the others. Newer than the table but not recent, their slots filled with dust. Around them was a circular outline, very faint, about the size of a dinner plate. A disc of cedar had been fitted into the underside, its grain running differently from the oak. Her breath slowed without her permission. She did not open it then, not immediately. Discovery had a temperature, and she had learned not to handle hot things barehanded. She stood, walked outside, and washed her face in cold water from the bottle. She returned, read the relevant pages in the repair book because she needed her eyes to pass over ordinary words, then gathered tools: flashlight, chisel, scraper, the old spoon, the wooden pestle, a saucer from the shelf to hold screws, and the patience to do no harm. The screws resisted. One turned after she cleared the slot with the tip of the chisel. Another stripped slightly before catching. The third would not move until she pressed the screwdriver handle with both palms and leaned her weight upward from beneath the table, arms shaking. The fourth came loose all at once and dropped into her sleeve. She found it against her elbow and laughed once, soundless and startled. The cedar disc did not fall when the screws were removed. It had swollen in place. Hazel worked the scraper around the edge, careful not to splinter it. A smell rose from the seam, dry and aromatic, cedar holding its breath across decades. She eased the chisel under one side and twisted no more than a 1/4 inch. The disc shifted. Dust fell into her hair. She moved to the other side, lifted again, and caught it with her free hand as it came loose. Inside the opening was darkness, then cloth. Hazel lowered the flashlight. The beam struck a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with blackened string. Beside it lay another bundle, longer and narrower, wrapped in linen gone brown at the folds. Behind both, tucked deeper, was a square tin box with a hinged lid and no visible lock. The space was larger than the opening suggested, extending upward into the hollow under the mortar, which explained why the stone had never shifted. It was not only weight, it was a seal. She sat on the floor before removing anything. Her legs had begun to tremble, and she did not trust her hands while they belonged partly to hunger, partly to awe. The room had grown darker. Rain whispered against the high window. Somewhere in the front room, water dripped from her coat hem into a pan. At last she reached inside and took out the linen bundle first. The fabric cracked softly where it had dried around its contents. Hazel untied the string by working each knot loose rather than cutting it, though a knife would have been quicker. Inside lay tools wrapped in individual sleeves of cloth, a small brass scale tarnished but intact, a set of measuring spoons hand-cut from silver or some pale metal, their bowls deep and irregular, a glass dropper with a red rubber bulb hardened to uselessness, a narrow-bladed knife folded into a bone handle yellowed by age, a porcelain pestle, not marble but fine and white, its end polished from years of circular pressure, a thermometer in a metal case, the scale marked up to 220 degrees, a little packet of paper labels printed but unused. Heirloom tools. Hazel wrote, then crossed out the phrase because it seemed too greedy to name inheritance before knowing whether she had any right to it. The oilcloth bundle came next. It was heavier than it looked and smelled faintly of wax metal and dry lavender. Inside were packets wrapped in more paper, each labelled in brown ink: beeswax, filtered, 1936, dried lavender tops, 1935, oat straw, last cutting, skullcap, passion flower, rose geranium resin, lard tins cleaned, muslin boiled. The plant matter was no longer fit for use, but the labels themselves were a kind of instruction. The handwriting was firm, slanted slightly forward, and familiar only because careful people sometimes resemble one another across time. At the bottom of the oilcloth lay a leather notebook. Hazel touched it but did not open it yet. The leather was dark, hand-worn, and tied with a cord. She set it aside on the cleanest part of the table, away from the damp. The tin box remained. It was painted black once, though much of the paint had worn from the edges. No name on the top. No lock. Only a lid fitted tight enough that it took both thumbs to lift. When it opened, the smell was not old paper, but metal. Coins filled the bottom in stacked rolls and loose cloth packets. Silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, dimes, each separated with a care that made Hazel's hands hover rather than seize. On top lay a folded inventory sheet and a small medal wrapped in tissue. Hazel lifted the medal first because it was nearest and because the human eye goes to shape before number. It hung from a faded ribbon, bronze darkened at the edges, with the year 1918 engraved on the back beneath a name she could not yet read in the fading light. She placed it beside the notebook. Then she unfolded the inventory sheet. The list had been made in columns. Coin type. Count. Face value. Notes. Hazel read it once without understanding, then again with the slow alarm of arithmetic becoming real. Morgan silver dollars 1878 through 1904, 211 pieces. Peace dollars 1922 through 1935, 46 pieces. Barber half dollars 180. Walking Liberty half dollars 92. Barber quarters 247. Standing Liberty quarters 110. Mercury dimes 483. Roosevelt silver dimes early issue 36. A small roll of Indian head cents, 3 gold-colored trade tokens from local businesses, loose foreign coins marked sentimental, no sale. The sheet included values penciled in by a later hand, not merely face value but careful estimates, perhaps from a dealer or a catalogue. Some numbers had question marks. Some had been revised upward. At the bottom, in the same forward slanting ink as the labels, someone had written, estimated reserve value if needed, $38,417.63. Do not sell in haste. Count twice. Use only for shelter, tools, taxes, and the keeping of this work. Hazel did count twice. Not all that afternoon, it took hours, then part of the next morning. She cleaned a space on the table, laid down cloth and arranged the coins by type exactly as the inventory instructed. She did not polish them. She knew enough not to improve what age had made valuable. She counted by stacks of 10, then 20. She wrote numbers on Everett's scrap paper and compared them to the sheet. When her attention blurred, she stopped. A miscount was easy when hunger and astonishment sat at the same table. The Morgan dollars were heavy, each one a round assertion of another economy. Some were worn nearly smooth at the cheek, others held feathers and stars with surprising sharpness. The piece dollars seemed gentler in the hand, though that may have been only the name. The Barber coins had solemn profiles, severe and patient. The Mercury dimes were the hardest to count, small bright things slipping toward the edge of the cloth. She handled them with the care of someone sorting seeds in wind. The military medal bore the name Amos Whitcomb Hale, 1918, and on the folded tissue someone had written Argonne in pencil. Hazel knew just enough history to understand the word belonged to a battlefield and not to a town nearby. She set it apart from the money. The medal was not reserve. It was witness. As the count grew, so did the practical terror of it. The money could save the building. The money could also expose her to every person who believed need was proof that anything in her hand belonged better elsewhere. She had no bank account worth naming, no safe, no lock beyond a county key and a front door that could be shouldered open by a determined man. Wealth, when it arrived without protection, looked very much like danger. By late afternoon she had returned most of the coins to their packets, following the inventory order. She placed the tin box back inside the hollow space, but not before removing the leather notebook, the medal, the tools, and the inventory sheet. The coins stayed. She could not carry them. She could not spend them. She could not yet even fully believe them. The cedar disc went back loosely without screws, and she shifted a crate beneath the table to disguise the opening until she could think better. The leather notebook waited under her hand. She untied the cord and opened only the first page. The handwriting matched the labels. At the top, in careful ink, someone had written recipes for the quieting of mind and the comfort of the nervous system, being preparations of Bellwether Botanical Rooms, revised and kept by Eudora W. Hale. Beneath that was a date from the 1930s and a line in smaller script, for the one who comes after, if such a person can still be found. Hazel closed the cover. The room shifted around her, not in structure, but in meaning. The shelves were not simply shelves. The drawers were not simply containers. The heavy table, the mortar, the ruined labels, the faint smell of dried plants beneath dust, all of it had been arranged around a question and left to wait beyond the lives of the people who asked it. The question had found her not because she deserved it, and not because suffering purified anyone, but because some chain of chance, care, neglect, county paperwork, and 4 remaining dollars had not broken before reaching her. She carried the notebook, medal, and a single measuring spoon outside before dusk. The rain had stopped, mist lifted from the slope in slow torn veils. Behind the shop the water run made its narrow way between stones, fuller now after weather, moving with that exact sound water makes when it is both going somewhere and staying itself. Hazel walked to the black walnut trees and stood beneath them until drops from the leaves struck her shoulders. The ground smelled of hulls, wet soil, and green bark. She did not read the notebook that night. She could have, the light would have been poor, but she had the flashlight. Curiosity was awake in her, sharp and restless. Yet some doors needed mourning, some inheritances, if that was what this was, required the courtesy of clean hands, a swept table, and enough daylight to see not only the words but the spaces between them. So she sat on a limestone rock near the spring run and watched the water darken as evening gathered. Cars passed only twice on the road beyond the walnuts. A thrush called from the underbrush, then went quiet. The shop behind her looked less abandoned from outside, now that she knew one of its secrets, but no less fragile. A roof leak did not care about silver, rot did not pause for astonishment. Winter would still come when it came. Hazel held the medal in one palm and the wooden pestle in the other. Metal and wood. War and kitchen. Loss and practice. Both objects had been shaped by hands that expected the future to be difficult and worth preparing for. At last she rose, went inside, and placed the notebook on the work table beneath the cleanest cloth she owned. The tools lay beside it in a careful row. The medal she set apart on the sales counter, where morning light would find it before she did. Then she lay down in the front room. not sleeping for a long while, listening to the building's slow ticks, to the roof's occasional drip, to the small hidden water moving under the hill. The world had not become easy. It had become exact. The shop was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning came with a thin white light and the sound of water answering itself under the hill. Hazel rose before the sun had cleared the walnut branches. Her back had stiffened overnight, and when she sat up, the floor seemed to hold a print of every bone that had rested against it. She did not reach for the leather notebook at once. Instead, she folded her coat, shook dust from the sweater, and carried the tin cup outside to rinse it beneath the spring pipe, using the water only for washing, because caution had not yet become less necessary than thirst. The shop waited behind her with its windows grey and filmed, its sign hanging at the same weary angle, its roof dark from the night's damp. She went back inside and made a fire so small it could have been hidden under both hands. The kindling caught more quickly this time. Smoke climbed, hesitated, then found the old passage upward. A little heat entered the workroom after she opened the rear door between rooms, enough to soften the stiffness in her fingers. She wiped the centre table with the clean side of the flour sack towel, then set out the things from the hollow in a row: brass scale, measuring spoons, bone-handled knife, porcelain pestle, thermometer case, medal, inventory, leather notebook. The order steadied the room. It made the discovery less like an accident and more like work. Only then did she open the notebook. The first page, the one she had seen the evening before, held the title in that forward slanting hand. The second page listed tinctures and oils. The third held ratios, substitutions, cautions in the margins. The fourth page had been left blank except for one pressed blue flower, flattened beneath a strip of paper browned with age. Hazel turned pages slowly, keeping one hand flat near the binding so the old leather did not crack. Near the middle, a folded letter had been sewn into the notebook with 2 loops of thread. It was not loose. It had been placed there deliberately, held between pages that described lavender oil and skullcap steepings. The envelope had no address, only a line written across the front in the same careful hand, to the one who opens what was kept. Hazel touched the writing and knew, not by memory but by kinship of motion, why Mrs. Pritchard had remembered Willa. The letters had that same discipline, that refusal to decorate what needed to remain useful. Willa's handwriting had leaned differently, heavier at the beginning of each word, but the spirit of it was near enough to make Hazel sit down before cutting the thread. She used the bone-handled knife because it had been left for careful openings. The thread parted with a sound too slight for the size of the moment. Hazel unfolded the letter along its original creases, not flattening them entirely. Old paper kept the shape of having been hidden. She would not force it to forget. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has come under your hands, then the room has outlived my fear for it. That is no small thing. Rooms built for healing are often emptied by harder years, and the shelves where people once came for comfort are as easily turned to storage, then dust, then county paper. I have written this because Dr. Samuel C. Whitcomb of Little Rock told me on the 4th day of October 1936 that the growth in my left breast had gone beyond the knife's clean hope. He spoke gently, and I was grateful for that, but gentleness does not change the road. I returned to these hills knowing that time had shortened itself, and I began to decide what must be kept. I'm Eudora Wren Hale, born in 1879 near Kings River, daughter of Miriam Bellwether Hale, born 1851 in Carroll County, and Thomas Hale, born 1844 in Greene County, Tennessee. My mother was the daughter of Elspeth Bellwether, who came with her people from Kentucky in 1836, carrying seeds in a tobacco tin and a pewter spoon wrapped in linen. Elspeth's mother, Annis Wren Bellwether, was said to have learned simples from a Quaker woman near the Holston River before the family moved westward. Before Annis there are only fragments: a Welsh grandmother named Catrin, a midwife in Pennsylvania, a woman whose hands smelled of thyme and smoke. I have no proof for all of them. I have only the work, and the work remembers. Bellwether Botanical Rooms closed to the public on May 18, 1919. I write the date plainly because loss without a date becomes fog. That morning 3 women came for nerve powders, and 1 quarryman came for salve. By noon, a notice had been posted regarding influenza precautions and commercial remedies. By evening, my brother's name had arrived in a telegram already handled by too many strangers. He had served in France and died after the armistice from wounds and fever at a hospital near the Argonne. My husband, Amos Whitcomb Hale, never fully returned from that war, though his body came home in 1920. Our only son, Daniel, was taken by pneumonia in 1927 after helping a neighbour through winter stock chores. 3 losses do not make a woman holy. They make her quiet in places other people cannot enter. For more than 30 years I opened these drawers only for those who knocked softly and could keep confidence. I did not advertise. I did not argue with doctors or tonic men or preachers who mistrusted women with jars. I made comforts, that is the proper word. Comfort does not claim to conquer suffering. It sits beside it with clean hands. If you mean to practice any of these preparations, begin with cleanliness, patience, and record. For a calming oil, dry lavender tops and oat straw thoroughly before use. Any dampness invites rot. Use 1 part dried lavender, 1 part dried oat straw, 1/2 part skullcap leaf, and 1/4 part rose geranium if available. Cover with 4 parts sweet almond oil or clean rendered lard warmed only to 105 degrees, never hotter. Hold between 100 and 110 degrees for 3 hours in a water bath, stirring every 20 minutes with wood or porcelain. Let stand covered with muslin for 7 days in a dim place. Warm again to 100 degrees, strain through boiled muslin twice. Then add beeswax at 1 ounce to 8 ounces of oil if a firmer balm is wanted. Pour when clear, label with date, source and weather. For a night tea, do not boil the gentle leaves. Use 1 teaspoon passion flower, 1 teaspoon oat straw, 1/2 teaspoon skullcap, and 3 lavender heads to 1 pint of water drawn just off the boil. Cover for 9 minutes, strain. Sweeten only if the person can bear sweet things. This is not for heavy dosing, not for children without knowledge, not for women carrying life in the body unless a physician approves. If the pulse races from grief, first give warm water, a blanket, and silence. Many remedies fail because the room is unkind. You will find coins beneath the mortar. They are not treasure in the storybook sense. They are roof, tax, winter, tools, and time. Spend them slowly. Let no man with a loud opinion tell you what haste is worth. There is also a medal. It belongs to Amos, and through Amos to the house, and through the house to memory. If you cannot keep it, place it where soldiers sleep under names. Inheritance is not possession. It is a duty that has crossed loneliness without dropping what it carried. If you have come here by need, do not be ashamed. Need has brought more honest hands to my door than pride ever did. If you have come by accident, sit a while before deciding it was only accident. Grind nothing in anger. Gather nothing you cannot name. Promise nothing to a suffering person that a plant cannot keep. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Eudora Wren Hale, Bellwether Botanical Rooms, November 12th, 1936. Hazel read the letter once with both hands on the paper, then sat without moving until the fire settled into a bed of quiet orange. A coal shifted in the hearth and gave off a soft collapse, ash folding inward on itself. Outside, a crow crossed above the roof and called once, its voice rough as a torn hinge. She read the letter again. The second reading moved more slowly. She paused at the names, at the dates, at the phrase loss without a date becomes fog. She touched the line about comforts, not cures, and her finger left no mark. When she came to the instructions, she followed them as if she were already standing over a water bath with a thermometer in her hand, holding the oil below its limit, stirring every 20 minutes, keeping dampness out, keeping promises small enough to be honest. At the end, she did not fold the letter quickly. She placed each crease back where it had been, edge to edge, letting the paper remember its own shelter. She returned it to the notebook but did not sew it closed. The thread lay on the table in 2 small lengths, finished with its long guarding. Then Hazel stood because remaining seated had begun to feel like asking the letter to carry her weight. The back door had swollen in its frame, and it took her shoulder, hip, and both hands to persuade it open. Damp air entered at once, carrying the green smell of the slope. Behind the shop, the ground rose in a shallow shelf before steepening toward cedar and walnut. The spring run crossed the lower part in a channel no wider than her forearm, clear water moving over flat stones the colour of old pewter. Ferns grew thick along its edge. Wild ginger leaves shone near the base of the hill. A broken length of gutter lay half buried under moss. Eudora's notebook had mentioned a marker near the rear boundary, not in the letter itself, but in a margin beside a formula for resin salve. Look beneath the shoe in the walnut. The sentence had seemed so plain that Hazel nearly missed it. Now she walked uphill slowly, holding the trunk of one sapling, then another, until she reached the older walnut behind the chimney. It was larger than the two by the road, its bark ridged deep enough to hold rain long after weather passed. About shoulder height, partly swallowed by new growth and lichen, a rusted horseshoe had been nailed into the trunk. The tree had grown around the iron. Hazel brushed moss from the shoe with her sleeve. Beneath it, almost hidden where bark had folded over the lower curve, was a narrow line carved into the wood, EWH. The letters were not decorative. They were a hand raised from another century, saying here, this is the place. At the roots lay a flat stone half covered in leaves. Hazel cleared it and found more carving, worn shallow by weather. Not a grave marker, a boundary mark perhaps, or a place where someone had stood to remember without inviting the town to watch. The stone bore only 3 initials and a date, AWH 1918. Hazel crouched until her knees dampened in the leaves. She did not speak. Speech would have made the place smaller. Instead, she placed one palm on the cold stone, then on the walnut trunk, feeling the living ridges of bark around the dead iron the horseshoe had held. The tree had held it by refusing to remain the same. When she went back inside, the workroom looked less ruined than interrupted. On the high shelf above the cabinet behind 2 cracked jars, she had noticed earlier a narrow wooden box blackened by smoke and age. Now she climbed onto the strongest chair, braced one hand against the wall, and lifted it down with care. Inside lay 6 candles wrapped in waxed paper, each no longer than her hand, cream-coloured and faintly scented with beeswax and something resinous beneath. A slip of paper tucked under the string read winter stock, poured 1963. Someone after Eudora had made them. Someone had kept coming, at least for a while. Hazel chose one candle and set it in an iron holder from the hearth shelf. She did not light it for romance. The room needed a witnessed flame that was not merely for heat. She struck a match from the small book Everett had added to the box of supplies, sheltering the flare with one cupped hand. The wick resisted, then caught, its flame leaned blue at the root, gold above, and for several seconds the smell of old beeswax filled the workroom so purely that the dust seemed to step back. She placed the candle on the centre table beside the letter, the medal, and the tools. Its light touched the marble mortar, turning the grey veins soft. It found the brass scale and entered its tarnish. It made the bone handle of the knife look briefly warm, like something living under skin. The chain of small kindnesses that had brought Hazel to that flame arranged itself without ceremony. The woman in the laundromat who had placed a banana beside folded pyjamas and pretended not to see hunger receiving it. The security guard at the university library who had used the word policy but not shame. The farmer near Green Forest who had left coffee on a fence post and walked away before thanks could make either of them uncomfortable. Mrs. Pritchard with her exact warnings and yellow line on the map. Everett Holloway writing her name into a ledger as if it belonged there. None of them had saved her life in the loud way stories often preferred. They had simply refused to let one hard hour become harder by their hand. Each act had been modest enough to disappear if no one kept it. Hazel understood then why Eudora had written names and dates into everything. The world was always losing evidence of mercy, and you watching this now may have one of those moments kept somewhere in you. A sandwich handed over without fuss, a ride in bad weather, a teacher who stayed after the bell, a neighbour who saw your porch light out and came with a bulb, not advice. If there was a small kindness that found you when you were nearly out of strength, write it down where somebody can see it. Tell us who gave it, if you can. Not every inheritance is hidden under stone. Some of it is passed hand to hand on ordinary afternoons, and it survives because someone finally says the name aloud. Hazel did write the names down, Not in Eudora's notebook. That book had its own order, and Hazel would not crowd it with her first unsteady need. She used one of Everett's blank circular pages and titled it in pencil, "Those Who Did Not Make It Worse." Underneath she wrote 5 names or descriptions, leaving space because she had learned that a ledger should expect continuation. Her hand paused over Lorna but did not write. This was not a book for judging the absent. It was a book for keeping the useful light. Evening came without rain. She carried the medal to the front counter and placed it where the morning sun could touch it again. She wrapped the letter in clean cloth and set it inside the leather notebook, then wrapped the notebook in her folded sweater. The measuring spoons went into a drawer she had cleaned twice. The brass scale she left on the center table, not for display, but because the room seemed to have been waiting for its return. Before sleeping, she checked the cedar disc beneath the table and slid it back over the hollow without fastening the screws. The coins remained below the mortar, dark and patient, their usefulness still unopened. She placed the old candle in a saucer beside the hearth until the flame burned low enough to pinch safely between damp fingers. The smoke rose in a narrow thread, carrying beeswax into the rafters. That night Hazel did not sleep with the key against her ribs. She placed it beside the notebook and the wooden pestle, all 3 wrapped in the sweater near her shoulder. The heirloom tools lay within reach. The shop settled around her in its language of tick strips and cooling brick. Outside, the spring run continued under the hill, saying the same thing over and over without becoming less exact. Hazel closed her eyes with one hand resting lightly on the folded cloth, and in the dark, the building no longer felt like a place she had entered by mistake. The first snow arrived on December 3rd, just before dawn, and laid 4.5 inches over Mill Hollow Road with the patient authority of something that had always meant to come. Hazel woke because the shop had gone too still. Snow changes sound before it changes sight, drawing a woolen cover over roads, branches, roofs, and the small uneasy movements of night animals. When she opened her eyes, the front windows were pale, not with sun but with reflected whiteness. The ceiling above her had darkened in 2 places. One stain was familiar near the back chimney, and one was new, a narrow seam above the shelves marked motherwort and mullein. The new leak had not yet begun to drip, but the plaster around it had taken on the swollen look of bread before baking. She rose without haste because haste on a bad floor was another form of foolishness. The fire had died down to red beads under ash. Her breath showed in the roof. She warmed her fingers above the coals, put on both shirts, her sweater, coat, scarf, and gloves, then carried the old repair book to the counter and opened the roofing chapter. She read it once standing, once sitting, and once with a pencil in hand. The chapter began with warnings about ladders, weather, rotten sheathing, and the false confidence of people who had survived one repair and thought themselves roofers. Everett had marked several lines in the margin long before the book came to Hazel. Do not roof over rot, do not trust wet shingles. Keep 3 points on ladder, measure twice, buy once, pay once. The handwriting was squared and blunt, like the man himself. Hazel drew the roof from the ground, then measured what she could safely measure. The front plane ran 22 feet across with a 10-foot rise to the ridge. The back plane was the same width but rougher, with a patched tin section near the chimney and cedar shakes soft enough to lift by hand at the edge. The overhang was shallow, 6 inches at most. The porch roof added another narrow plane, 9 feet deep and 19 feet wide, though its worst damage could wait if she kept snow from entering the main wall. At Holloway Hardware, Everett looked at her measurements, then looked out the window toward the whitening street. You are starting late, I know. You are starting because it has started leaking. Yes, that is how most roofs get religion. He pulled a pad toward him and made his own calculation in clean, quick numbers for the main roof. Allowing overlap, waste, and the foolishness of old angles, she needed 9 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles, though he recommended 10 if she could bear the account. 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, 1 box of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails, 1 bundle of drip edge for the front and back eaves. Step flashing around the chimney, though he frowned and said the chimney would have its own judgment later. Roofing cement, 1 quart, chalk line, utility blades, 2 roof brackets borrowed, not bought, 1 ladder longer than Hazel liked looking at. The old cedar wants replacing whole, he said. You cannot afford whole. No, so we keep water out through winter and do no harm that makes spring curse us. He wrote the list into the ledger and did not read the total aloud this time. That silence was a kindness with its sleeves rolled up. From under the counter, Everett brought out a roofing hatchet wrapped in oilcloth. Its head was dark steel, one side a hammer face, the other a small cutting blade, with a gauge notch worn shiny from use. The handle had been replaced once and shaped to a palm no longer living. My brother used this when roofs were still half cedar and half stubbornness, he said. He is dead 12 years. It has been in the drawer long enough. I cannot take that. You can bring it back when your hands know what it is. Hazel held it as one holds a tool before understanding its temper. The balance was forward, eager but not reckless. Everett sent her not with the hatchet alone, but with a name. Jonah Rusk lives up beyond Magnetic Road, he said. Roofed half this town before his knees betrayed him. If he tells you to stop, stop. If he tells you to move, move. He will not take pay, but he will take coffee, and he has no patience for being thanked more than once. Jonah arrived the next morning in a faded brown truck with 1 blue door, a thermos on the seat, and snow clinging to his boots. He was 78, narrow as a fence rail, with a white beard cut close under the chin and eyes the pale green of lichen on stone. His left knee did not bend fully, so he walked with a measured hitch, but his hands moved over lumber, ladder, and shingle bundles with the exactness of a man whose body had forgotten nothing important. He stood across the road and looked at the apothecary for a long while. Bad valley at the chimney, he said. Yes, soft decking. Some. You been up? No? Good. That was the first lesson. Not doing a dangerous thing before help arrived could count as skill. For 11 days they worked when weather permitted and waited when weather required it. Waiting, Jonah said, was cheaper than falling. He refused to step on the roof at first. Instead, he taught Hazel from ladder height, making her sound the sheathing with the back of the hatchet, tap by tap, listening for the difference between wood that held wood that had punked beneath the shingles and wood that lied under a dry skin. Where the roof near the chimney had softened, he showed her how to cut back to sound material, not to the neatest line, because rot did not care whether a rectangle pleased the eye. They sisted 1 rafter from inside the attic crawl using a 12-foot length of 2x6 alongside the cracked original, clamped tight and fastened with staggered 16-penny nails. Jonah made her mark every nail location first, so the wood would not split and the load would not gather in one place. Boards remember insult, he said. On the roof he let her pull damaged shakes and tin patches while he watched from the ladder. The old nails came out with groans. Some broke and had to be driven flush. Snow slid in little sighs from the upper slope, dusting her sleeves and neck. Her fingers numbed inside the gloves, then burned when feeling returned. She climbed down every hour because Jonah made her, though impatience pressed harder than cold. That nail's proud. Hazel bent closer. Pull it. She pulled it. Again. She set another. 3 strokes. He meant it: first stroke to set, second to drive, third to seat, no more unless the roof demanded correction. A hammered-to-death nail bruised shingle and wood alike. Hazel learned to hear the change when the nail head came home, a small flat note under the hammer face. She learned to snap a chalk line tight enough to sing, and then trust it even when the roof's old waves tempted her eye away. She learned that felt paper wrinkled if hurried, that shingles cut cleaner when cold only if the blade was new, and that roofing cement stuck to gloves, sleeves, hair, and dignity with equal devotion. Jonah's teaching style held no comfort, but also no contempt. He spoke in fragments because roofs did not require speeches. Foot there, not there. Weight low. Watch the edge. Good enough. Not pretty. On the 6th day, the sun came out with no warmth in it, lighting the town below in bright winter pieces. From the roof, Hazel could see the road bending through the hollow, the 2 black walnuts by the front path, the stream flashing between stones, and beyond it the hills rising blue and brown, folded one behind another. She did not look long. Heights punished dreamy people. By the 11th day, the worst plain was covered. The chimney valley, patched for winter, felt tucked clean beneath the new shingles, drip edge holding the eave line, and the remaining older roof tied in under a temporary run of tarped overlap that would not win prizes, but would shed water. Hazel climbed down after the final nail and stood in the yard while Jonah examined the work from every angle. The date was December 15th. Snow remained in the shaded places. Her shoulders felt as if ropes had been tied from bone to bone and tightened. Her hands smelled of asphalt, cold metal, and old cedar. Jonah sipped from his thermos. Spring will tell you what winter missed. Yes. Mr. Rusk. He looked at her. Jonah. Yes. Jonah. He nodded once toward the roof. It will hold. He did not say she had done well. He did not need to. The roof, in its plain way, had already said it by not leaking when the next snow came that evening. By January, the chimney began shedding itself in red dust. Hazel noticed it first on the hearthstone, a powdering of brick and mortar fine as cinnamon along the back edge where the firebox met the wall. When she brushed it away, more loosened beneath her fingertips. Outside, standing in the yard with her coat pulled tight, she could see the problem more clearly. The upper courses had spalled under years of freeze and thaw. Faces of brick had flaked off in scales. Mortar joints had recessed so deeply that snow found ledges where there should have been lines. The patched roof had kept water from entering freely, but the chimney remained an old throat with broken teeth. Everett came to look at it on a morning when the temperature sat at 26 degrees and did not intend to improve. He stood behind the building, hands in his apron pockets though he was not in the store, staring up at the stack. His breath left him in short clouds. If you build hot fires under that, he said, you will learn regret. I have kept them small. Keep doing that until it is repointed. Some bricks replaced. Cap reset if it can be moved without crumbling. I do not know how. You will know more by supper. At the store he sold her what she needed and refused what she did not. No modern Portland heavy mix, he said. Not for old soft brick unless she wanted the mortar harder than the thing it held. He measured hydraulic lime, clean sand and fire clay from sacks in the back, explaining ratios with a scoop and the back of a receipt. For exterior repointing above the roofline where heat was less direct, 3 parts sharp sand to 1 part natural hydraulic lime. For firebox repair and the lower throat, 2 parts sand, 1 part fire clay, 1 part lime, mixed damp not soupy. Mortar should cling to the trowel and fall only after being asked twice. He added a narrow pointing trowel, a joint raker, a soft brush, and a small spray bottle. Old brick drinks, he said. Mist it first. If it steals water too fast, the joint fails. For 3 weeks Hazel worked in temperatures that remained mostly in the 20s, rising above freezing only long enough to make mud before hardening again. She could not do the upper exterior alone, and Jonah's knee would not permit ladder work on frosted ground. So Everett sent a man named Milo Teague for the high courses, a mason who spoke only when a sentence improved the job. Milo replaced 6 bricks, reset the cap, and showed Hazel how to pack mortar without smearing the face of the brick. He took payment in store credit from Everett's ledger and 2 jars of black walnuts from someone else's account, a transaction Hazel did not pretend to understand. The lower work was hers. She began inside with the firebox. First she scraped away loose mortar, not gouging sound joints, only removing what had already failed. The joint raker made a dry rasp that set her teeth on edge. She brushed dust from each groove, then misted the brick until the surface darkened but did not shine. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow intervals. Inside, her breath clouded the work each time she leaned close. The mortar mixed best in small batches. Too much at once stiffened before her hands could use it. She set a board across 2 crates, poured sand through a screen to remove pebbles, added lime and fire clay in their proper measure, then folded the dry materials with the trowel until the color became even. Water went in by spoonfuls at first, then by cautious splashes. The mixture changed from dust to damp earth to something with body. When it held a ridge, she stopped. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for the narrow joints, and the wet lime found every split across her knuckles. She worked with fingertips, packing mortar deep, pressing, smoothing, then stepping away before perfection ruined the line. Every quarter hour she went to the front room, held her hands near the smallest fire she dared maintain in the stovepipe she had rigged for heat, and waited for pain to return. Numbness was easier. Pain meant she could safely work again. Milo had warned her not to over-tool the joints. Firm, then leave, he said. So she learned to leave. That was harder than mixing. The chimney demanded a kind of patience different from the roof. Roofing had been broad movement, wind, height, visible progress. Chimney work was inches, a groove cleaned, a joint misted, mortar pressed into a line no wider than a finger, dust swept, edge corrected. Wait! The work made her aware of every breath because her face was so often near brick that had held the breath of other fires, other winters, other hands warming themselves in the workroom. On the coldest morning when the thermometer outside the back door read 19 and the inside of the front windows wore lace made of frost, Hazel dropped the trowel and sat back on her heels. Her hands had stopped obeying the smaller instructions. Mortar smeared across one wrist. Her nose ran. A patch of hair had escaped her scarf and stuck to her cheek with sweat and lime dust. She stayed there until the shaking passed. Then she cleaned the trowel before anything else, because tools did not deserve neglect merely because the person using them had reached her limit. By late January, the lower joints had cured enough for a test fire. Everett came for that, and so did Milo, though both pretended they had business nearby. Hazel built the fire smaller than fear required. Paper, cedar splinters, 2 dry sticks of oak no thicker than her wrist. The damper was open. The room was swept. A bucket of sand waited beside the hearth. The flame caught. Smoke rose. They watched the chimney. At first nothing happened except the ordinary small adjustments of heat moving through cold masonry. Then above the roof a clean thread of smoke lifted straight into the grey morning before the wind took it apart. No smoke entered the workroom. No bitter backdraft pressed into Hazel's eyes. No ominous crack opened along the firebox the old throat drew. Everett looked up at the chimney, then at Hazel's hands. Do not make it proud. No! Proud chimneys burn houses. Milo tapped the new joint with one knuckle after it had warmed. Fair. From him, the word had the weight of a certificate. That evening Hazel made a meal of beans warmed slowly in the tin cup, with a heel of bread toasted on a forked green stick. The fire burned a little larger than any before it, still modest, still watched. Heat entered the bricks and remained after the flame lowered. For the first time the workroom held warmth long enough for Hazel to sit at the table without wearing her gloves. She opened Eudora's notebook to the page on warming oils, not to begin making anything yet, but to read the temperatures again. 100 to 110 degrees. Never hotter, stir every 20 minutes, let stand covered. The chimney behind her gave off a low mineral heat. Outside the night settled in the 20s. Inside, the air around the hearth no longer felt borrowed. The floor waited until the chimney could keep a fire, because sanding in deep cold was work for people with either better circulation or worse judgment. The planks were white pine, though age and grime had hidden their original character under grey dust, black stains, old varnish, and the dragged scars of storage crates. They ran lengthwise through the front room 7 to 9 inches wide, some straight, some bowed, none identical. Many were held with hand-cut rose-head nails, their small irregular heads sunk into the wood like dark seeds. Near the counter 2 boards had split along the grain. Under the left window, one plank had rotted where rain had entered for years, and Hazel marked it for replacement with a piece Everett found in his lumber shed, salvaged from a house torn down near Holiday Island. She began by setting every proud nail. The repair book devoted only 3 paragraphs to this, but Everett made it sound like a moral obligation, A sander could throw sparks from metal. Worse, it could tear the head from an old nail and leave the board more wounded than before. Hazel moved across the room on hands and knees with a nail set, hammer and chalk. Tap, tap, test. Circle the ones that lifted. Sink them just below the surface. Do not crush the fibers, do not hurry because the room seems empty. Rooms are never empty once work begins. The replacement board took most of a morning. Everett cut it to length in the store, but Hazel trimmed the final edge by hand, shaving it with a block plane. Jonah had loaned her and warned her not to drop. The new old plank slid into place after 3 tries, tight but not forced. She fastened it with cut nails, driving at a slight angle as the book instructed, each strike measured. The fresh lines stood pale among darker boards, but Everett said time and oil would make neighbors of them. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day, and Hazel treated the machine with the wary respect due to anything that could ruin what it was meant to repair. Everett showed her how to change discs, how to keep the pad moving, how to let the tool's weight do the work. He sent her with 80 to 120 grit discs in separate paper bags, each labeled in pencil. Start coarse enough to tell the truth, he said. Finish fine enough not to brag. The first pass with 80 grit filled the front room with a smell Hazel had not expected. Pine, not dust only, not decay, but pine released from under decades of foot traffic, spilled tinctures, ash, damp, varnish, and neglect. The scent rose warm and resinous under the machine, and for a moment the room seemed to inhale its own past. Hazel worked in narrow lanes, overlapping each pass. Keeping the sander moving with both hands, the machine hummed through her wrists into her shoulders. Dust bloomed beneath it and fled toward the edges, where she later gathered it with broom rag and a patience that had become less fragile through use. She wore the mask until sweat dampened it. She opened the front door despite the cold. Fine powder settled over the counter, shelves, her hair, her lashes, the glass jars, the old labels, and the empty bell above the door. Every hour she stopped to sweep, because grit left on the floor became new scratches under the next pass. The work was not simply sanding, it was preparing to sand again. At 120 grit, the room changed colour. The grey lifted. The pine beneath emerged unevenly, darker in paths where feet had walked for a century, lighter beneath old furniture shadows, amber near the hearth, almost blonde where the replacement board lay under the window. The scars remained. Hazel did not try to erase them all. Deep cuts near the counter stayed as lines of use. A burn mark by the stove remained a dark oval. Willa had once said a table without marks was either new or unloved, and the same seemed true of floors. At 220 grit, the work became quieter. The sander no longer fought the surface, it whispered over it, taking roughness from the grain without denying the plank its age. Hazel moved slowly enough to see where light caught. Her arms trembled by the final lane. When she turned off the machine, the silence after the motor felt like stepping into snow. The oil came next. Everett recommended a mixture suited to a modest floor, not a museum finish. Tung oil cut for the first coat so it could enter the wood, then linseed oil blended for warmth, each coat wiped thin, never left puddled. Hazel read the can labels twice, then the repair book, then Everett's handwritten note. Flood lightly, wait 20 minutes. Wipe hard, dry rags outside flat. Oily rags can burn a building quicker than lightning. Second coat after 48 hours. Third after another 48, if weather allows. She applied the first coat with cloth wrapped around a block, moving with the grain. The wood drank unevenly at first. Thirsty in open grain, resistant where old finish remained deep in the boards. She waited, then wiped. The wiping mattered more than the applying. Excess oil sat on the surface like false generosity and turned sticky if allowed to remain. Hazel rubbed until her shoulders ached, until each plank held a low glow instead of shine. The colour deepened from dark honey to something near mahogany in the oldest paths. 48 hours later came the second coat. The shop smelled of oil, pine, ash, and winter air. She kept the fire small and the rags outside on a flat stone, spread open under a piece of wire so the wind could not take them. Another 48 hours, then the third coat. By then the floor no longer looked rescued all at once. It looked kept. That was better. The bad morning came between the second and third coat. Hazel woke before dawn with her hands curled tight from pain, and her thoughts refusing to arrange themselves into tasks. The roof still needed spring work, the chimney needed watching, the windows were broken. The money under the mortar was too much responsibility and not enough immediate help unless she dared carry coins into town. The notebook's instructions sat beyond her skill. Her body had become a ledger of bruises, split skin, hunger, smoke, lime and cold. She put one foot on the floor and then did not stand. For an hour she remained seated beside her folded bedding, watching the window lighten. Then she did something that felt at first like failure. She did not work. She wrapped herself in the coat, took the wooden pestle and walked beyond the rear slope to a marshy stretch where the spring run widened before slipping under brush. Snow had melted there in ragged patches, leaving black water between yellowed grass. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, still as a thought that had not yet chosen words, its long neck folded into itself. Its grey-blue body held the morning without asking anything from it. Hazel sat on a flat stone and watched. The heron did not hurry. It lifted one leg with such slow precision that movement became almost invisible, placed the foot down, waited, then struck into the water and came up with something silver and small. It swallowed, rearranged its neck, and resumed stillness. No one praised it. No one told it stillness was laziness. The marsh received its patience as part of the day's design. Hazel stayed until her fingers went numb and the sun reached the upper branches. When she returned to the shop she still did not work. She made tea from nothing medicinal, only warm water with a shaving of dried orange-peeled Doris from the cafe had slipped into a paper bag of day-old rolls. She sat on the sanded floor in her socks away from the oiled sections and watched the light move across the boards. The shop was not empty. It had been waiting. The next day she put on the third coat. February announced itself through the windows because the windows had never agreed to keep weather outside. There were 8 in all, counting the 2 display windows in front, the high workroom window, 3 narrow side windows, 1 rear sash near the hearth, and a small square window above the back door. 3 had no glass left, only jagged teeth in the sash or boards nailed across the opening by someone who had expected to return and never did. 4 were cracked in long wandering lines, some stable, some waiting for a careless hand. 1, the narrow side window in the workroom, still held its original wavy glass, marked faintly in the lower corner, with a date scratched so lightly Hazel needed morning light to see it. 1888, not 1788, the second numeral nearly closed by a flaw in the pane. Everett told her not to replace it unless a storm took it from her hands. "That glass has seen more winters than any of us," he said. "Let it keep looking." So she began with the others. Window work was smaller than roofing and less brutal than chimney repair, but it had its own exact stubbornness. Old glazing putty had hardened to stone in places and softened to chalk in others. Points rusted away or broke under the scraper. Paint clung in scales. Sash cords had snapped in 2 windows, leaving the frames heavy and unbalanced, their counterweights hidden in pockets behind trim. Everett sold her DAP 33 glazing putty, a handful of glazier's points, a putty knife with a blade flexible enough to obey, and 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from the roll he had set aside weeks earlier. He showed her the cord's weave, the way synthetic could slip where cotton held, and drew a small diagram of the figure-8 knot used to secure the counterweight. "Do not make a granny knot," he said. "I know the difference. Most people think they do until a window drops." Hazel took the diagram anyway. The first sash took 2 days because fear slowed her more than difficulty. She removed it from the frame and laid it across the work table on folded cloths. Broken glass came out piece by piece, wrapped in newspaper and placed in a crate marked sharp. She warmed hardened putty with a heat gun. Everett had loaned under stern instruction not to scorch the wood or poison herself with old paint fumes. The putty softened reluctantly. She scraped it away in narrow curls, revealing the rabbit beneath, then brushed dust from the channel, and rubbed the wood with a thin line of oil where it had gone dry. The new glass was cut at Holloway Hardware. Each pane measured 1/8 inch smaller than the opening to allow the frame its seasonal movement. Hazel set the first pane into a bed of putty, pressing lightly along the edges until it seated without strain. Glazier's points went in with the putty knife, not hammered, each one pushed flat against the glass and wood. Then came the outer bevel, the part that looked simple when Everett demonstrated and nearly impossible when Hazel tried it alone. The putty stuck to her fingers, tore under the blade, lifted where it should smooth and sagged where it should hold a clean angle. She scraped it off twice and began again. On the third attempt, she learned to warm it in her palm, roll it into a rope, press it into the rabbit, and draw the knife in one continuous motion, firm but not severe. The bevel did not need vanity. It needed to shed water. By the third window, her lines improved. By the fifth, she could feel when the knife had the right pressure. The sash cords required a different patience. Hazel removed the narrow stop trim carefully and set each piece aside in order, because old trim returned best to the place that had shaped it. Behind the side pocket, the counterweight hung in darkness, iron and dusty, attached to a rotten length of cord that gave way as soon as she touched it. She caught the weight with both hands before it dropped. It was heavier than expected, cold as creek stone. She threaded the new cotton cord over the pulley, down into the pocket, and tied the figure 8 knot exactly as Everett had drawn it. Around, through, back, Stighton. The knot looked modest, but when she tugged, it held. She tied the other end to the sash, rehung it, and lifted. The window rose. Not smoothly. Not yet. But it rose under her hand and stayed where she placed it, neither slamming nor sliding down like a reprimand. Cold air entered around the edges, but less than before. She lowered it, lifted it again, and allowed herself that repetition as proof. For the original wavy glass window she did almost nothing. She cleaned the pane with vinegar and soft cloth, avoiding the scratched date. She replaced only the outer putty where it had failed, keeping the old glazier's points if they still held. Through that glass the world bent slightly. The walnut branches outside seemed to swim when the wind moved them. Light entering through it did not fall straight, but arrived with a tremble, as if remembering water. The last window was the small rear sash near the hearth. By then February had softened at the edges, though morning still came hard with frost. Hazel worked with the sash open on the table, the fire small behind her, the old candle stub nearby though unlit. She had saved this window because it faced the walnut tree with the horseshoe, and some unreasonable part of her wanted the view restored only when her hands could do the job without clumsiness. She removed cracked glass, cleaned the rabbit, laid the new pane, set the points, and drew the putty knife along the final bevel in one settled motion. Outside, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch nearest the wall. It weighed almost nothing. The branch barely changed. The bird turned its black-capped head toward the window and studied Hazel with the brisk seriousness of winter birds who believe all large creatures are slow and possibly foolish. Hazel held still. The chickadee hopped once, shook snowmelt from its feet, and pecked at something hidden in the bark. Its body was compact, exact, alive against the grey afternoon. Behind it, the rusted horseshoe remained half swallowed by the tree. Beyond that, the slope lifted toward cedar and stone. When the bird flew, the branch rose back into place. Hazel set the sash aside to cure and clean the putty knife with a rag. Her hands were steadier than they had been in December. Not stronger in any grand sense, more acquainted with what strength cost. The shop had new glass in 5 openings, repaired glass in 2, and one irreplaceable pane that still bent the world gently before letting it in. That evening, with the rear sash propped safely near the hearth, she sat on the oiled floor and looked through the front display windows at the road beyond the black walnuts. The room was still unfinished. Shelves needed repair. Plaster waited with its own demands. The back room still held more questions than answers. But when the wind came down Mill Hollow, it no longer moved through the apothecary, as if the building had no skin. It met glass, and the glass held. The plaster failed first near the chimney, which was fair, because that was where the building had been asked to endure heat, water, smoke, and neglect all at once. Hazel found the first loose patch by sound. She was sweeping the workroom after rehanging the rear sash when the broom handle touched the wall beside the hearth, and the plaster answered with a hollow tap, not the firm, dull note of material still married to its lath. She set the broom aside and tapped again with 2 fingers. Hollow, hollow, firm, hollow. The damaged area spread wider than the visible crack, a soft-edged continent beneath whitewash darkened by age. There were 3 failed patches in all. One above the firebox where steam and smoke had worked through a crack, one beside the chimney breast, low and wide, where old damp had loosened the keys behind the surface, one narrow strip near the repaired window, not dangerous yet, but ready to become so when summer humidity pressed its way into the room. The original plaster was horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath. Everett confirmed it when he came by with a sack of lime and stood close to the wall, picking gently at a broken edge with his pocket-knife. "Do not tear out more than has let go," he said. "I was afraid you would say that." "That is because you are learning." Behind the failed plaster, the oak lath showed itself in narrow, uneven strips, each split by hand and nailed across the studs with gaps for plaster to push through and harden into keys. Some keys still held behind the sound sections, gripping like curled fingers. Others had broken away, leaving dusty crumbs in the wall cavity. Hazel brushed the exposed lath with a soft whisk broom and found it dry enough to save. Everett brought out an old paper sack from the back of his store, folded twice at the top and marked in fading ink from the 1950s. Inside was clean horsehair, saved from his father's time, when people still repaired plaster instead of covering every trouble with wallboard. He would not sell the whole sack. "You need a handful, not a relic." He mixed the first batch with her in a galvanized pan. Lime putty, sharp sand, and horsehair teased apart carefully so it would not clump. The hair gave the wet plaster a strange living texture, fibrous and stubborn. For the scratch coat, he made it coarse, pressing it into the lath so it pushed through the gaps and sagged slightly behind before catching. Hazel scored the surface with horizontal lines once it had firmed, making tooth for the next layer. "Do not pet it," Everett said. She lowered the trowel. "I was smoothing. You were petting." The brown coat came after the scratch coat had taken hold. 3/8 of an inch, no more, built proud enough to meet the old surface after the finish. Hazel kept a small wooden gauge beside her because her eye wanted to lie. She misted the old edges before applying each batch, packed material in from the perimeter inward, and used a straight board to bring the patch into plane with the wall around it. It was slower than she expected, and heavier. Plaster had a way of seeming passive in the pan, then asserting its weight once lifted above shoulder height. The brown coat needed 72 hours to cure before finishing. Hazel wrote the hour in pencil on a scrap and pinned it to the wall with a glazier's point. Waiting had become part of the repair, not the absence of it. On the 3rd day, she mixed the finish coat thin and fine. 1/8 of an inch. Lime, fine sand, and patience, it went on pale grey and slowly brightened as she worked it. Her trowel marks showed at first, then softened under a damp brush and careful pressure. She did not make the patches invisible. That would have required more skill than she possessed and more vanity than the room deserved. She made them sound flat enough, breathable, and honest at the edges. When the last patch had firmed, she stood in the workroom with lime dust on her sleeves and hair, looking at the wall where 3 wounds had become 3 repairs. "These patches will hold another 100 years." She said it without raising her voice. The room did not answer, unless drying plaster counted as speech. Perhaps it did. Doris Meacham owned the cafe between Holloway Hardware and the narrow watch repair counter, and for several weeks Hazel knew her only by the sound of dishes being stacked before sunrise. The cafe opened earlier than any tourist wanted breakfast, and later than most locals admitted they wanted pie. Its windows wore lace curtains browned slightly by steam, and its door stuck in damp weather with a squeak that could be heard half a block away. Doris was a square-built woman in her late 50s with hair pinned under a red scarf, forearms dusted in flour, and glasses that slid down whenever she leaned over the register. She spoke to customers as if each were a task on a list she intended to complete properly. Hazel had avoided the place because hunger made cafes dangerous. Smells were not bills, but they reminded the body of unpaid accounts. She passed with her head down until one morning a paper bag waited on the apothecary porch, folded once at the top and weighted with a smooth stone. Inside were 2-day-old rolls, a small jar of bean soup, and a note written on the back of a guest check. Too much made. Do not make me throw it out. There was no signature. The next morning there was another bag. Cornbread wrapped in waxed paper, an apple with one bruise cut out, coffee grounds in a twist of paper, already used once perhaps, but still fragrant enough to give hot water a memory of bitterness and warmth. Hazel carried the empty jar back to the cafe in the afternoon, washed and dry, with 3 coins in her palm. Doris looked at the coins, then at the jar. No, I can pay something. You can reopen someday? That may not happen. Then I will have been wrong for free. Hazel set the jar on the counter. I do not want charity. Good. I do not give it. Doris wiped the counter where no spill existed. What do you call it? An account. With what payment? Doris looked toward the hills visible through the window, then back at Hazel. In candles when the shop reopens. The sentence settled between them like a contract neither needed to decorate. Hazel nodded once and put the coins back in her pocket. From then on, bags appeared irregularly, never enough to make dependence easy, always enough to make one more day's work possible. Doris never mentioned them in public. Hazel never thanked her where others could hear. Caleb Pike was not kin to Warren, though the shared name made Hazel's hand tighten the first time Everett said it. He is 15, Everett said. Maybe 16. Hard to tell because boys that age are made of elbows and appetite. He asked whether you needed wood split. I cannot pay him. He said you would say that. Caleb arrived on a Schwinn bicycle with chipped blue paint, a milk crate wired over the back wheel, and a splitting maul balanced dangerously across his handlebars. He was narrow, brown-haired, and serious in the theatrical way of boys trying not to seem young. A red scarf covered one ear, but not the other. His boots were too large and his wrists stuck out from his coat sleeves. My mother said you might need help, he said. With what? Wood. Carrying? Heavy things. Not roof. No roof. I know. Mr. Rusk told everybody. He said this without malice, as if community news were a weather system nobody controlled. Hazel led him to the pile of fallen limbs behind the chimney, and Caleb examined it with the solemnity of a hired man twice his age. He set a chopping block upright, tested the maul head, and began splitting cedar and oak into uneven but usable pieces. His first swings were too forceful. The maul stuck. He put one boot on the block and wrestled it free, embarrassed enough to redden. Let the head work, Hazel said, before remembering she had no right to instruct him. Caleb tried again. Better. He came twice a week after school when weather allowed, splitting wood, carrying water, stacking shingles left from the roof work, and once helping Hazel move the heavy crate from beneath the mortar table without asking why it had been placed there. He refused money each time with increasing irritation. My mother said, that is not an explanation. He leaned on the maul handle, breath showing. About your grandfather, Hazel stilled. I do not have a grandfather here. Caleb looked toward the road, uncomfortable with whatever errand of memory he had been given. She said maybe not grandfather. Somebody before, a Bell woman or Bellwether. She said her grandmother used to come here for sleeping drops after the first baby died. Said they did not make her forget, just helped her lie still without breaking. My mother said we owed wood if nothing else. Hazel did not know what answer fit such a debt. Thank you was too narrow, refusal too proud, so she showed Caleb how to stack the split pieces bark side up along the dry wall, angled for air, and gave him one of Doris's rolls wrapped in paper for the ride home. He accepted that because teenage boys had fewer principles where bread was concerned. Reverend Boyd entered Hazel's life mostly by passing it. He was the minister of a little church above the hollow, though Hazel did not learn which one until months later. Every morning except Monday at nearly 7, he walked down Mill Hollow Road wearing a black coat gone shiny at the elbows, a brimmed hat, and boots polished even in mud season. He was tall and spare, with dark skin lined finely around the eyes and a white mustache trimmed close. He carried no Bible in sight. His hands were usually clasped behind his back, unless the road iced over, in which case he carried a cane with a brass tip. The first morning, she lifted his hat as he passed the walnuts. Hazel was on the porch prying loose a rotten board. She paused, uncertain whether to speak. He did not force the matter. He only tipped the hat and continued. The next morning, the same. On the fourth morning, she stopped long enough to look at the sign above the door. Bellwether, he said. Yes, good name. Then he walked on. As weeks passed, his brief acknowledgments became part of the shop's clock. Hat lifted. Step, step, step down the hollow. Sometimes, if Hazel was outside, she offered 4 words without stopping. Lord, keep your hands. That was all, not advice, not invitation, not an attempt to gather her into a pew before she had found steady footing. A passing prayer, 4 words long, placed beside the road like a cup of water. Hazel did not know what she believed about it. She only knew that on mornings when Lyme had cracked her skin or the roof had groaned under ice, the words stayed with her longer than many sermons would have. One cold morning after sleet, Reverend Boyd found her spreading ashes on the path for traction. He paused by the walnut and looked at the horseshoe half swallowed in the trunk. Some trees keep iron, he said. Yes, some people too. He tipped his hat and continued. Hazel stood with the ash bucket in one hand until his steps faded, then returned to the path. The work did not become lighter, but it became witnessed. Hazel postponed the cellar until February 11th because every sensible part of her distrusted unseen lower spaces. The door to it was in the back workroom under a mat of warped boards and fallen paper, set nearly flush with the floor behind the preparation table. She had discovered the iron ring in December while sweeping, then covered it again because the roof had been leaking and the chimney had been shedding dust and winter had no patience for curiosity. The repair book said nothing helpful about old cellars except to check for bad stairs, bad air, standing water, snakes, and the general consequences of human optimism. Everett sent a lantern, a length of rope, and a warning. Open it and wait. So Hazel did. She lifted the ring with both hands. The cellar door came up grudgingly, its hinges complaining in a low iron voice. Cold air rose from below, smelling of stone earth, old apples, and the clean mineral damp of the spring run. She propped the door open with a crate and waited an hour before descending. During that hour she tied the rope to a table leg, set the lantern on the top step, and listened for movement that was not water. There were 7 granite steps down, each one slightly in the middle, each slick at the edges where damp collected. Hazel tested the first with her boot. Then the second. The rope ran through one gloved hand. Her other hand held the wall, fieldstone cold under her palm. No railing, no forgiveness. At the bottom she stood still until her eyes adjusted to the lantern light. The cellar measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Its floor was fieldstone, uneven but deliberate, fitted by hands that had understood water's habits. A shallow channel ran along the far wall, carrying seepage toward a drain no wider than a cup. Shelves lined the right side, mostly empty except for 3 stoneware crocks, 2 broken demijohns, and a crate of dark bottles so old the corks had shrunk away from their necks. Roots had entered through one corner and hung thinly like brown threads from the mortar. In the center of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the fieldstone around it. It was rectangular, smooth-faced, and set with care. At its near edge was a carved mark, a mortar and pestle enclosed in a simple bell-shaped outline. Not decorative, a craft mark. The same symbol, Hazel realized, had appeared faintly on the corner of Eudora's labels, and on the old printed wrappers flattened under boards in the workroom. She knelt beside the slab and brushed dirt from the carved lines. Then she stood. Every story she had ever heard wanted the slab lifted. Every sensible hour since May told her not to be ruled by story. The cellar was cold, the stone was heavy, she was alone. The roof still needed spring judgment. The plaster was curing, and there were enough mysteries above ground to last a lifetime. "Not today," she said. Her voice fell flat against stone and stayed there. She inspected the shelves instead, finding nothing urgent beyond damp and broken glass. On the way back up, her left boot scraped the underside of the third step and dislodged a small shower of grit. Something knocked once against granite. Not the sound of stone, not the sound of loose mortar. She stopped, one foot on the fourth step, one on the fifth, and lowered the lantern. Wedged beneath the third step, pushed far back between the stone support and the stair itself, was a small oak box. It had swollen slightly with damp, but had not rotted. No lock, only a brass clasp green at the hinge. Hazel worked it free with the bone-handled knife, careful not to pry against the step. The box came loose all at once and nearly slipped from her hand. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because cellars had their own hunger for drama, and she had no wish to feed it. In the workroom, under winter light, she opened the clasp. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in tissue. The key was old, heavier than the county key, with a long narrow shaft and a bow shaped like the Mortar and Bell craft mark. Hazel turned it in her hand. The edges had worn smooth where fingers had held it many times. It did not belong to any door she had seen. Not the front, not the back, not the cabinet drawers. The bow alone made it feel less like a tool for opening and more like a question with teeth. The photograph was small, dark, and sharp in that haunting way old images can be sharp, preserving a second while refusing to explain it. A young woman stood in front of the apothecary, though the building looked newly painted then, its sign straight, its windows clear, its porch boards bright. The woman was 25 perhaps, with hair pinned high, sleeves rolled, and a long apron tied at the waist. In one hand she held a porcelain pestle. Her face was not Hazel's face exactly. Time, blood, and chance do not copy, but the resemblance was close enough to make Hazel sit down. The cheekbones, the set of the mouth when not smiling, the watchful eyes that seemed prepared to listen before speaking. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Miriam Bellwether Hale, daughter of Elspeth Bellwether, age 25, summer of 1903. Hazel placed the photograph beside Eudora's letter and looked from one to the other. 4 generations in ink. A face in silver and shadow, a key whose bow carried the shop's mark, a slab she had not lifted and would not lift. The future had opened one small box, then closed its hand again. She set the brass key on the mantel where she could see it from the front room. It caught firelight differently from the steel county key, warmer, less practical, more patient. She did not know what it opened. For once, not knowing did not feel like deprivation. The cellar door was closed before dark and weighted with 2 crates. The granite slab below remained in place. Spring did not arrive as a declaration. It retreated winter by inches. First, the snow withdrew from the road edges, leaving gravel, black leaves, and flattened grass pressed into the shapes they had held beneath ice. Then the creek grew loud with snowmelt, no longer muttering under the hill but speaking in a bright, crowded voice as it ran over stone. Walnut catkins appeared like green-brown tassels along the branches, and the blackened husks underfoot softened into the ground that would take them back. Ferns uncurled behind the chimney. Wild onion came up near the path, sharp and clean when bruised. Hazel opened the front door on mild afternoons and let air move through the rooms. It carried out lime dust, smoke, old mouse smell, and the stale cold held in corners. It brought in damp earth, cedar, road dust, and once the smell of Doris's bacon drifting all the way down from town. The repaired windows held the roof, though temporary in places, shed March rain without surrender. The chimney drew, the plaster dried pale and firm under her hand. The apothecary did not look finished. It looked alive enough to be unfinished. That was when the temptation came to begin the old work at once. Eudora's notebook lay on the centre table most evenings, open to pages Hazel could nearly recite. Lavender and oat straw, skullcap and passion flower. Temperatures held below 110 degrees, 7 days covered in a dim place. Label with source and weather. The tools were clean now, oiled where metal required it, wrapped where edges needed protection. The brass scale had been polished only enough to function, not enough to erase itself. The measuring spoons rested in a drawer lined with cloth. Hazel had enough money below the mortar to buy every dried herb in a catalogue, every bottle, every label, every clean jar. That was exactly why she did not. In late March, she carried one Morgan's silver dollar to a coin dealer in Berryville after asking Everett how not to be cheated. She did not take the rarest year. She did not take the brightest coin. Everett examined it first, wrote down what it was, and told her a fair range. The dealer gave her within that range because perhaps he was honest, or perhaps Everett's handwriting on the folded note made dishonesty feel less convenient. With that one coin, Hazel ordered modest materials, amber bottles by the dozen, not the gross. Muslin, beeswax, dried lavender, oat straw, skullcap, and passion flower from reputable growers whose sources could be named. A thermometer accurate enough for caution. A notebook of her own plain black, with pages that would accept ink without bleeding. She bought no printed sign, no grand opening banner, no promise larger than her hands could keep. She practiced on small samples through April, oil without herbs first, learning heat control in the water bath, then lavender alone, then oat straw. She ruined one batch by letting condensation drip from the lid into the jar and wrote the failure down. She overheated another by 6 degrees and marked it not for use. She learnt the difference between a scent rising cleanly and one turning dull from too much warmth. She learned that waiting 7 days was harder when she had chosen the waiting herself. People began to notice the light in the front room at dusk. Mabel the dog resumed her inspections of the porch. Caleb leaned his bicycle near the walnut and asked whether the shop would sell licorice. Doris sent a bag containing rolls, soup, and a note that read candle debt accumulating. Reverend Boyd paused one morning, looked at the repaired windows, and gave his 4-word prayer as if it belonged to the building too. Hazel still slept in the front room, though. Now on a narrow cot Everett found in a church storage closet, and claimed had been waiting to be useful. She kept the brass key on the mantel. Eudora's letter wrapped in cloth, the photograph in the drawer beneath the scale, and the coins below the mortar where stone and cedar guarded them better than any confidence of hers could have done. By the last week of April, the hills were washed in new green. The spring run ran clear. The apothecary's sign still hung crooked, but Hazel had cleaned the letters enough that Bellwether Botanical Rooms could be read from the road if a person slowed down. She decided not to begin the craft that spring. Not truly. Not for others. Not yet. She would learn through summer. She would gather only what she could name, buy what she could trace, ruin small batches, keep records, repair shelves, study the old recipes, and wait until her hands no longer trembled when someone asked what the shop was for. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Hazel completed the first preparation she was willing to let leave the apothecary. Snow lay in a narrow line along the north side of Mill Hollow Road, not deep yet, but enough to brighten the ditch and soften the black walnut roots where the ground held cold. The shop windows glowed at 4 in the afternoon with lamplight and hearthlight together. The sign above the porch had been rehung level, not replaced, its old board cleaned, sealed, and lettered only where weather had taken too much. Bellwether Botanical Rooms could now be read without effort, though the words still looked as if they had crossed a great distance before arriving. The preparation was a balm, poured in 12 2-ounce tins lined in a row on the work table. Lavender oat straw skullcap and rose geranium in sweet almond oil warmed 3 hours between 100 and 108 degrees, stirred every 20 minutes. Stood 7 days under muslin, warmed again, strained twice, and set with beeswax at the ratio Eudora had written. Hazel had made the formula 9 times in small batches before this one. 3 had failed by her standards. 2 were pleasant but not steady. 1 had clouded after a week because moisture had entered. 1 smelled too strongly of rose geranium, which taught her that scent could become vanity if allowed to lead. The last 2 were close enough to make her try again. This batch was quiet. Not weak, not showy. Quiet in the way clean linen is quiet, in the way a room becomes quiet when a person finally stops pretending not to be tired. The balm cooled to a pale green-gold surface, smooth but not glossy. Hazel labelled each tin by hand, quieting balm, lavender, oat straw, skullcap, external use, date, batch number, weather, snow beginning, north wind. She did not call it healing. She did not call it a cure. She did not borrow authority from suffering. She made comforts. The restored interior held the work without disguising the years behind it. The front room shelves had been repaired one board at a time, sagging sections lifted and braced with oak strips planed from salvaged lumber. The drawers behind the counter opened now, though some still complained. Their labels had been copied onto new paper and slipped over the old ones rather than replacing them entirely, so the earlier hand remained faintly visible beneath Hazel's. The pine floor had darkened under 2 winters of careful oiling and slow traffic, its scars showing like lines in a palm. The plaster patches near the chimney had cured into pale islands, honest at the edges. The original wavy glass pane remained in the workroom, bending morning light across the table where the brass scale sat. The back room was no longer a ruin of questions. It was a room of tasks. Amber bottles stood in small numbers, never more than Hazel could account for. Dried herbs were kept in sealed jars with source date and cautions written clearly. The marble mortar remained at the centre table, too heavy for daily use, still guarding the hollow beneath it. Hazel used the porcelain pestle for smaller preparations and the wooden pestle for memory more than work. Eudora's notebook rested in a drawer wrapped in cloth, brought out only with clean hands and a clear table. The brass key stayed on the mantel until the afternoon the walnut gave up its answer. It happened after the first hard freeze of that second winter. Hazel had gone behind the shop to cut dead stems from the path when she noticed a strip of bark lifted near the horseshoe in the old walnut. The tree had continued growing around the iron, slowly swallowing both the shoe and the years, but frost had opened a seam just below it, and within that seam something pale green showed, not leaf, not moss, metal. Hazel set down the pruning shears. She cleared the area gently with the bone-handled knife, removing only loose bark, never cutting living wood. The seam widened enough to reveal a small brass plate set into the trunk long ago and nearly covered by growth. It was no larger than her palm, darkened with age, bearing the same mortar and bell mark as the key. At its centre was a narrow keyhole. She did not run inside. She walked, because some answers deserved not to be startled. The key fit. It turned with difficulty, then gave way in a small internal movement that seemed less like unlocking than remembering. A hidden cavity opened within the old scar of the tree, lined with tin and cedar, dry despite all seasons. Inside lay a folded flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The flag had 48 stars. Hazel knew enough from library reading to understand the time held in that cloth. It was folded with military precision, the blue field showing stars yellowed slightly with age. The red stripes deepened toward brown at the creases. Beneath it lay a paper dated November 11th, 1919, written in the same family line of careful hands, though not Eudora's older script, to the keeper of this room. This flag was sent home after Amos Whitcomb Hale returned from service in the Great War, though he said it belonged more to the men who did not return than to him. He asked that it not be displayed for praise. He asked that it be kept where roots could hold silence better than walls. If the tree still stands, let it stand. If the tree falls, take the flag to a place where soldiers' names are read with care. There is no glory in fever. Mud. Gas. For the waiting of wives? There is only the duty not to let the dead become convenient. Eudora says I'm too plain in writing. I say plain writing lasts. Miriam Bellwether Hale, Armistice Day, 1919. Hazel stood beneath the walnut with the flag in both hands and the note held against it by her thumb. The cold had entered her sleeves, but she did not move until the wind shifted and sent dry leaves along the ground in a brittle whisper. Above her, the horseshoe remained embedded in the living wood. The tree had kept iron, brass, cloth, paper, grief, and instruction through years when no person had been able to keep the room open. She carried the flag inside and placed it on the work table beside Amos's medal. The anniversary came months later, on September 26, the opening date of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Hazel had written it in her calendar after reading county histories, military records, and a library book whose margins were clean because no one in town had checked it out in years. She did not make a ceremony. She borrowed Everett's truck because the weather threatened rain, wrapped the medal in cotton, and drove to Eureka Springs Cemetery, where rows of stones rose and tilted under cedar shade. Amos did not rest there. His grave, she learned, was in another county where his mother had insisted he be buried beside his people, but 3 men from Carroll County who had served in the same war were named on stones near the upper slope, and one had died in 1918. Hazel stood before those names, placed the medal on a folded cloth for 1 minute, and read Amos's name aloud once. Then she read the 3 names carved there. No one heard but the crows, the cedars, and perhaps Reverend Boyd, who had come to the cemetery road without announcing himself, and stood at a respectful distance with his hat in both hands. When the minute had passed, Hazel wrapped the medal again and took it home. The money beneath the mortar remained nearly whole. In 2 years, Hazel spent only 4 coins, 1 Morgan dollar for the first materials, 1 common date silver half for winter taxes when a county deadline approached before candle orders paid, 1 worn quarter for replacement glass after a branch broke the square pane above the back door in an April storm, 1 dime, not valuable except by survival, which she carried to Doris and placed under the first tin of balm delivered as payment against the Long Café account. Doris told her the dime was unnecessary. Hazel said unnecessary things, sometimes belonged in ledgers too. The rest stayed wrapped, inventoried, and sealed again beneath the cedar disc. Hazel added her own page to the inventory, dated and witnessed by Everett, not because she intended to spend, but because secrecy without record could become another kind of loss. The note at the bottom was hers. For the next one, roof, tax, winter, tools, and time. Do not sell in haste. Everett read the line and nodded without comment. Then he replaced the screws more cleanly than before, not tight enough to split old cedar, not loose enough to invite curiosity. The marble mortar remained over the hidden space, stone holding silence with the plain, competent stone has always had. The shop reopened without reopening. There was no ribbon, no newspaper item, no photographer asking Hazel to stand in the doorway and become a symbol for people who loved symbols more than work. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and a flyer offering firewood delivery. It read, Bellwether Botanical Rooms, small batch balms, sachets, and quiet teas. Made carefully on Mill Hollow Road. Inquire by note at cafe counter. Hazel had written it 3 times before accepting the plainness of the 3rd version. Within a month, 11 people had left notes. Within 6 months, there were 43 names on a mailing list kept in a school composition book. Most were local. Some were women who cleaned cabins, 2 retired teachers, a quarry worker with cracked hands, a nurse from Berryville who wanted sachets for linen closets and nothing more, and 1 man who bought unscented salve because his wife disliked lavender, but missed the feeling of being cared for by something made slowly. Hazel filled orders only on Fridays. She did not promise more than she had. If a note described suffering too large for her work, she wrote back gently and recommended a doctor, a counselor, a pastor, a clinic, or simply a person who should not be left alone. Many remedies fail because the room is unkind. She kept that line above the work table, not framed, only written on paper and tacked where her eye could find it. Caleb returned in late spring of 2025 with a wooden sign tied across the handlebars of the same blue Schwinn. Though his knees had begun rising too high when he pedalled and the bicycle looked near retirement, he was taller by then, still narrow, still serious, with his hair falling into his eyes. The sign was wrapped in a feed sack. He would not let Hazel help untie it. My shop teacher had extra oak, he said. Hazel stood on the porch while he worked the knots. You made something. It is not perfect. Most useful things are not. He gave her a look that suggested adults were always stealing a boy's best defenses. When the sack fell away, Hazel saw the board. Hand-carved oak. Sanded smooth but not machine-flat. The letters cut deep and darkened with stain. Bellwether and Daughters. Botanical Rooms. Hazel read it once. Then again, the plural stood there quietly, asking nothing and changing everything. "I know there is no daughter," Caleb said quickly. "I mean, not that I know. My mother said it used to be women, more than one. And Mr. Holloway said the sign ought to tell the truth forward, not backward. Reverend Boyd said daughters can be a promise and not only a fact. Doris said if you do not like it, she will hang it in the cafe and tell everyone you have poor taste." Hazel looked at the boy. At the board, at the walnut trees, at the old sign above the door that had survived long enough to be joined rather than replaced. Did everyone discuss this? No, Caleb said. Then, after a careful pause, some. She ran her fingers over the carved letters. The cuts were not professional. One T leaned slightly. The ampersand was too large and more beautiful for it. Daughters had been carved with extra care, each letter clean, deliberate, Hazel did not cry. The body sometimes refuses public water out of dignity or habit. Instead she carried the sign inside and placed it on the counter. She made Caleb tea, not medicinal, only mint and hot water, and gave him 2 rolls Doris had left that morning. He ate 4 because he had become 16 in full. The new sign was hung beneath the old one the following Saturday. Everett brought screws. Jonah brought a level and distrusted everyone else's eye. Reverend Boyd held the ladder without making a blessing out of it. Doris stood with arms crossed and said the ampersand was the best part. Mabel the dog slept in the road until a truck made her reconsider. When the sign was secure, Hazel stepped back. Bellwether Botanical Rooms above. Bellwether and Daughters below. The building did not look famous. It looked named. That summer, Hazel began writing her own letter. She did not know who it was for, which was the first requirement. A letter written only to a chosen person becomes instruction. A letter written to the unknown must become welcome. She used a plain black notebook, not Eudora's, and wrote at the center table in the evenings after the day's work was cleaned, jars sealed, tools washed, floors swept, ashes banked. The brass key lay to her left. The wooden pestle lay to her right. The photograph of Miriam stood propped against the scale, not displayed for customers but present for the hand that wrote. She began with the same words. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped for a long while. The room around her held layers of labour. Roof nail, plaster hair, sash cord, oiled pine, clean jars, dried lavender, the repaired chimney cooling after supper, the marble mortar guarding what had not been spent. Outside, summer insects tuned themselves in the grass. Water moved under the hill as it had before her arrival, and would after her leaving. The walnut leaves rubbed together in the dark, each one a small piece of weather. Hazel wrote slowly. She did not make herself sound braver than she had been. She wrote the date she arrived, because loss without a date becomes fog and so does rescue. She wrote Mrs. Pritchard's name and Everett's, Doris's, Caleb's, Jonah's, Reverend Boyd's, Milo's, and the farmer with the coffee, though she still did not know his surname. She wrote that need is not proof of failure. She wrote that money must be counted twice and spent once. She wrote that plants deserve names, that heat must be watched, that promises to the suffering should be modest, that a building can keep a place open in a person long after people have tried to close it. She did not finish the letter that summer. Some inheritances should not be completed before one has earned the next sentence. She tied the notebook with cotton cord and placed it in the drawer beneath the clean labels. By late autumn, the apothecary had entered the town's life without asking permission to be central. People still drove past without noticing. Tourists still climbed the brighter streets and bought soaps from shops with polished floors. The county had other buildings to worry over, other notices to stamp, other structures leaning toward demolition. Bellwether did not become a destination. It became something steadier and smaller and harder to remove. A woman left a note asking for balm for hands roughened by hotel laundry. A widower bought sachets because his closet had smelled stale since the funeral, and he could not bear artificial perfume. Doris traded soup for candles poured in little tins. Everett kept Hazel's account in the old ledger, though by then she paid monthly and sometimes early. Caleb brought kindling when storms broke branches. Reverend Boyd still walked past most mornings and lifted his hat. "Lord, keep your hands." The phrase remained 4 words long. It remained enough. On the 2nd December evening after the first balm batch, Hazel closed the shop at dusk and stood outside beneath the 2 black walnuts by the road. The porch light behind her cast a modest square over the step. Through the front windows she could see the shelves, the counter, the old bell without its clapper, the new sign's shadow, the workroom lamp burning low beyond the half-open door. Nothing in the room glittered, nothing demanded witness. The most valuable things were either hidden, handwritten, or too ordinary for appraisal. A car passed slowly, then went on. Hazel locked the front door with the county key. The brass key stayed inside on the mantel because what it opened had already been returned to trust. She put both hands in her coat pockets and looked once toward the courthouse hill she could not see from the hollow. Somewhere in Mrs. Pritchard's office, unless the drawer had been cleaned, or the clerk had retired, or the county had replaced more paper with machines, there was a cash drawer that had once held 4 soft dollars. Hazel had asked months earlier, carefully, whether the original transfer receipt still existed. Mrs. Pritchard had opened a desk drawer and shown her one taped bill kept apart beneath a paperweight, marked in pencil with the parcel number and date. "I kept the first one," the clerk had said. County records are allowed 1 private habit. Hazel had not known what to say, so she had smiled in the small way that did not frighten either of them. Now the road darkened. The windows held their warm rectangles. Water continued under stone. The walnut branches shifted above her with the slow creak of living wood keeping old iron. The apothecary waits. It has always waited. Inside, on the counter, beside 12 tins of quiet balm cooling under muslin, Hazel's unfinished letter rested beneath a brass weight, its first line dry and ready for whoever would one day need it. The house was patient. So was she?